Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the BACS mini conference, co-hosted by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. I'm Christina, and I'm a project director with Quan. I'm joined today by my colleague, Glenn Patterson, who will be meeting in just a moment. Glenn will be handling the technical aspects of today's event. First off, for those of you who are not familiar with Quan, we are a province-wide organization engaged with its members in the preservation and promotion of the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular of Quebec's English-speaking communities. Today's event wouldn't be possible without the support of Heritage Canada and, of course, support from our members. Membership in Quan is open to everyone, regardless of linguistic or cultural affiliation. And one of the perks of Quan membership is receiving our printed quarterly publication, Quebec Heritage News magazine, which brings you stories from all across the province, highlighting Quebec's rich and diverse history. For more details on membership, please visit our website at qahn.org or send us a message on our Facebook page. Now, before we head over to day 2 of the BACS conference, I'd like to hand things over to my colleague Glenn, who's going to give a brief overview of some of the guidelines to follow for today's presentation.
Thanks, Christina. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Indeed, I'm here to help with tech. So if you're joining us on Zoom, I guess the most important thing to know is where your microphone mute button is and your start and stop video button are. They're at the bottom left if you're using a computer or laptop. If you are using a mobile device, iPhone, tablet, you might have to tap on the screen once, and then you'll see those buttons come up on the bottom left. During the presentation section, if you're in the audience, you won't be able to unmute yourself anyways, but during the Q&A, you will. So what we'll do there is if you have a question, you can just go into the chat box as well. It's along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Go in there and just tell us you have a question and we'll put you in the queue. If you're on a mobile, again, you might have to tap on the screen. You'll probably see 3 dots. Click there and then you should see a chat in there and you can send us a message. You can also use the raise hand feature if you know where it is. Not everyone does. For our viewers on Facebook, you can also leave your questions in the comment box. I'll do my best to check there and relay the questions over to our speakers. Other than that, I would say, just want to let everyone know that this Zoom call is being recorded. And so as long as you're okay with being recorded, all's well. But if you're you don't want to be on the video or whatever, just you can keep your video camera off. We can even ask questions on your behalf if you don't want to come on camera. Just type them in the chat box and we'll deliver them on your behalf. Otherwise, yeah, you can also check it out on Facebook if that's your preference. That's all I have for now. So Christina, back to you.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, we're going to officially open day 2 of the BACS mini conference. I'm going to call upon BACS co-secretary Ellie Bird of Lancaster University to give her word of welcome.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the BACS online conference. We had a really good day yesterday with a great panel and a Eccles Centre lecture and some really stimulating and interesting discussion. And today we've got 2 more panels to enjoy. So one on the October crisis and on public policy and constitutional questions. So we look forward to a really great set of panels and some interesting discussion. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ellie. So without much further delay, we're ready to start session 3. And I'm going to call upon the chair for this panel, Tony McCulloch.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina and Glenn. Well, it is my very great pleasure and privilege to introduce this distinguished panel. It is actually a repeat of a panel on the October crisis that we gave at the UCL Institute of the Americas in October of last year, so the actual 50th anniversary. One reason we wish to repeat it, apart from the fact that it was an excellent panel, and we got a lot of complimentary comments about it, was that that occasion was not video recorded. So anyone that missed it has not been able to see it. So very pleased to be able to run it again now. And it was originally going to be one of the BACS conference panels at Edinburgh last year, which obviously couldn't take place. So we've got 3 panelists then talking about the October crisis of 1970, mainly I think from a British perspective, and of course James Cross, or Jasper Cross, was a central figure from the British perspective in the October crisis. And we'll also be looking at it in an interdisciplinary way as well. So first off, and I'll introduce the 3 speakers, and then they'll give their presentations in turn, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So first off, Steve Hewitt is Senior Lecturer in American and Canadian Studies at the University of Birmingham. He's written several books and many articles and book chapters on Canadian topics, mainly in the field of intelligence, terrorism, counter-terrorism, and most recently a book that he co-authored with Christabel Cessna, Just Watch Us, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Surveillance of the Women's Liberation Movement during the Cold War. He makes regular appearances in the British media on Canadian topics, especially anything to do with terrorism and counter-terrorism, hopefully thankfully fairly rare. And he's also a former president of BACS. Steve will be giving a bit of introduction to October crisis before he does his presentation. Secondly, Patrick Holdich. Patrick is the head of the Foreign Office Research Department. I say Foreign Office, I should say Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as it now is. He's a former British Consul General in Montreal from 2009, I think it was, to 2012. Before that, he was the head of the political section at the British High Commission in Ottawa, 1992 to 97. Before joining the Foreign Office, he was a lecturer in history at Queen Mary College, University of London, and he's very much kept in touch with his academic roots, as it were, as a long-time friend of BACS and also of my own institute, UCL Institute of the Americas in London. And then thirdly, Carrie Morgan. Ceri is Senior Lecturer in English Literature and Creative Writing at Keele University. Again, her Canadian research, mainly in the field of Quebecois literature, and she is also the author of several books, articles, book chapters, etc., including, I think, probably her most notable one, Mindscapes of Montreal, Quebec's Urban Novel, 1860 to 2005. Ceri is also a long-term member of BACS, a great supporter of BACS and Canadian studies in the UK, and she gave the Eccles Lecture at BACS in 2016. So an excellent panel, and I'm sure you will very much enjoy what they have to say about the October crisis. So let's hand over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Tony. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Perhaps you don't want to see me, but at least hopefully you can hear me. And it's great to be here at another BACS conference. I think the first one I ever attended was in Edinburgh in 2000. And then since 2002, I've managed to make it to every conference except last year, but then no one made it to the conference last year. So it's great to be here today. I should explain that what I'm talking about today is very much a work in progress. It's part of a book I'm currently working on. I've been laboring on now for several years. I'm sure my publisher is not happy about that, but it's eventually going to be a history of terrorism and counterterrorism in Canada. And obviously there'll be a chapter on the October crisis and a chapter on the longer history of the FLQ in that book. So I'm going to do a couple of things in my presentation today. I'm going to do, as Tony mentioned, sort of provide an overview of the October crisis. And then I'm going to offer a little snippet of a document that I came across in the National Archives at Keele. There's a version as well in Library and Archives Canada, and I know it's been at least cited in one book, I think, a book about the letters between Pierre Trudeau and Marshall McLuhan. But I'm going to talk a little more about that document because it's interesting in the context of the October crisis, and that document is a transcript of a conversation that James Cross had 48 hours after he was released from captivity on the flight back to London. It was on a chartered plane with Canadian and British officials. And so it's his sort of almost immediate response privately to what he had just gone through over the previous 2 months. So that'll be the main focus of my presentation. So I'm going to, and hopefully this will work, goodness knows we've been doing this enough teaching. I'm going to share my screen and my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to speak to my slides. So hopefully you will all see this in a minute. And that should be it. So the title of the talk is The October Crisis and the FLQ Through the Eyes of James Cross. If anyone's on Twitter, please follow me and I'll follow you back. I have a couple of Twitter feeds. My main one is Steve Hewitt UK, but I also have one where I tweet exclusively about the history of terrorism and counterterrorism, terrorizing his one. Yeah, follow me and I will follow you back. So just a little background, and one other thing that's changed since we last did this in October, and that is that sadly James Cross has passed away. So James Cross, who was born the same year as the Duke of Edinburgh, lived to be 99, the same as the Duke of Edinburgh, passed away on the 6th of January 2021, sadly died of COVID. And so again, it's a chance for us in a sense to reflect on quite a remarkable life in general, but obviously a remarkable life that intersected with significant global events in October 1970. So James Jasper Cross was born in Ireland, was a World War II vet, fought with the British Army during World War II. Remarkably, and I think the fact that he was a war veteran and the fact that he had already experienced terrorism firsthand might account for some of what I'm about to tell you about how he reacted during his captivity. But remarkably, he was in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in July 1946 when it was blown up by Zionist terrorists who were attempting to create, which they eventually did, or helped create eventually in 1948, the state of Israel. So he had witnessed firsthand quite a major terrorist attack. And obviously, being a war veteran, had also obviously experienced people losing their lives and things such as that. He then subsequently joined the British diplomatic service and had a number of overseas postings. I think he went to Canada actually in the 1950s, and then had other postings, and then eventually returned to Canada in February 1968 as the British Trade Commissioner. Now, this is where we get into the actual events of the October crisis. That is the house that James Cross resided in as a British Trade Commissioner. That is the house where two members of the Libération cell of the Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ, kidnapped him on the 5th of October in 1970. Some of the images, and I've got a timeline in a minute, but just some of the images that are associated with the October crisis. Of course, the newspaper, the media coverage about Cross's kidnapping. And again, because he was a British diplomat, it got a lot more attention than if it had just been an event just connected to Canada. So there was obviously extensive interest in the British media. and the BBC, and obviously with the government at the time and with the Foreign Office. That, of course, is Pierre Trudeau. This is an image taken from his famous Just Watch Me interview that he did with the media. I'll talk more about that in a second. That's Pierre Laporte, Quebec cabinet minister, who was kidnapped by a separate cell of the FLQ and then was subsequently murdered. The middle image is the reading of the FLQ manifesto live on Canadian television, and it was read in both French and English, which was one of the demands of the FLQ, one of the few demands that the government actually gave into. Then you can see the deployment of Canadian soldiers in Montreal is sent in. And then finally, the bottom image is the trunk boot of a car where Pierre Laporte's body was discovered in the aftermath of his killing. So here's the timeline. And the timeline, I mean, obviously the timeline goes back to 1759, if we want to go back there, or even earlier. But the immediate timeline begins in 1963 to 1970, which is the appearance of the FLQ, a series of bombings, often against symbolic targets such as statues. I mean, again, we think of what the events of last summer, the targeting of Confederate statues in the United States, the targeting of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. The FLQ was targeting statues in the 1960s, blowing up the statue of James Wolfe, the British general at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, targeting a statue of Queen Victoria, blowing up mailboxes, all symbols of colonialism, of British colonialism, of subjugation of French Canada. And the FLQ was the label, but it was various people sort of almost taking on that label. It was a very not a centralized organization, a number of cells, individuals who would sort of do symbolic acts or sometimes acts that resulted in deaths through the bombings, and then add the label of FLQ to it. And it got more of a formal structure as the 60s went on, but again, it tended not to, it wasn't your sort of hierarchical terrorist organization. That leads up to 1970, the 5th of October, 1970, James Cross is kidnapped, as I mentioned earlier, by the Libération cell of the FLQ. It's the 8th of October, the FLQ manifesto is broadcast live. On the 10th of October, a separate cell, the Chenier cell, which was named after a patriot, a rebel, or a freedom fighter, depending on your perspective, going back to the rebellions in Lower and Upper Canada in the 1830s. So a separate cell kidnaps the Quebec Minister of Labor, Pierre Laporte. On the 13th of October is Pierre Trudeau is interviewed outside of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa and is asked about the soldiers in the streets and this is the famous back and forth. You can watch it on YouTube where Trudeau describes critics of the soldiers as sort of bleeding hearts, and they can go on and bleed. And the reporter asks him, "How far are you willing to go?" And Trudeau says, "Just watch me." And of course, that leads into the War Measures Act, which features the suspension of civil liberties, which leads to arrests of hundreds of people without charge in Quebec. Almost all of them are eventually released without ever being charged. So it's often seen as sort of a landmark event during peacetime in terms of the infringing on civil liberties in Canada. That leads to the murder of Pierre Laporte by the cell that was holding him. And then there's weeks and weeks of wondering what's happened to Cross. Has he been killed as well? And eventually the police, through their work, through informants, discover the house where Cross is freed, surround the house. There's negotiations take place with the kidnappers. They agree to release Cross. In return, the Canadian government allows them to fly to Cuba. So that's the 4th of December. And then literally the next day, Cross flies back to the UK, which is where I pick up my paper. So on the flight, and you can find this online. In 1998, Cross recorded a memoir as part of a Cambridge University diplomatic history project. And he mentions the release, he mentions the flight back, and he says in this interview, quote, "I gave a long description of the whole affair to Jim Davey, one of Mr. Trudeau's aides, but alas, he had failed to switch his tape recorder on." Now, Cross's memory actually betrayed him because, in fact, there is a transcript of that recording. Now, there were some technical problems with the recording, problems with the engines of the aircraft, making it difficult to hear, but the conversation has been created. There is a transcript of it, despite the poor quality. And at the beginning of the transcript, it mentions that the recorded remarks, in one or two cases, it was necessary to make an interpretation of what was actually said. A certain number of repetitive remarks have also been edited out. And this is the document that I won't use the word discovered, but came across in the UK National Archives at Keele. It was a Canadian government document, so there's also a copy in the Library Archives of Canada. So there was a number of officials on the flight. Cross's daughter Susan was there as well, someone from the British High Commission, and several people from the Canadian government. And the main interviewer was Jim Davey, the Trudeau aide, and you can see the quote hopefully on the screen about what they wanted from Cross. They wanted to get a better understanding of who the people were, what motivated them. This is often the response after a terrorist attack. You know, what was the motivation? The term is not used then; it's used now. This notion of quote unquote radicalization, which to me is highly problematic, but that's a whole other story. You know, and they wanted to know how much central control was there over this FLQ cell, how they reacted to Laporte's murder, what they responded to the War Measures Act, and obviously importantly, what were their plans for the future. So when you look at the transcript, there's sort of 5 themes that come across, which I'll speak to in terms of Cross's answers. And they're really quite interesting, his observations, and I think spot on in terms of my reading. And to me, the first one is the most significant, and this sort of connects to what I'm trying to do in the book, which is kind of break down this dichotomy of sort of distinguishing between quote unquote domestic terrorism versus international terrorism. And one of my main arguments is that there's an overlap, that there is no such thing as sort of purely domestic or purely international. It's just the degree of which something is domestic versus international. And the term I like as a sociological term is this idea of glocal, of something being both global and local. And so Cross, in responding about the motivation and the nature of the FLQ, and I'm quoting Cross's words on that plane, on the 5th/6th of October, I would say that there are 2 main influences on their political thought. The first one is a reading of Quebec history. They are very full of all the events of Quebec history. They see the total of Quebec history as a series of 2 centuries or 3 centuries of oppression. The first by the seigneurs of France, since 1759 by les Anglais, and now by the Americans. They see the Quebec people as an oppressed colonial people who are now struggling for national liberation. And I think that's often the sort of way that this event is interpreted. This is sort of a domestic Canadian event, you know, the traditional battle between the French and English. The second bit, I think, is the more significant in terms of challenging that traditional narrative. The second driving force is what I would call revolutionary Marxism, and revolutionary Marxism in terms not of Russia, not so much of China, but about the peasant revolutions of Cuba and particularly of Algeria. And it's from Algeria that they draw their main intellectual background. So this positions the FLQ and what they're attempting to do as a part of this decolonization that you see happening in across the world post-World War II. Liberation movements, obviously, you've got the Cuban Revolution, you have the Algerian Revolution. One of the texts the kidnappers gave Cross to read was Frantz Fanon, the important theoretician in terms about using violence to overcome colonialism. So Cross, I think, is again recognizing that this is a very complicated, multi-dimensional movement, and not to simply be reduced to this sort of simplistic kind of French versus English narrative. The second theme was what were its structures and the dedication of its members. Cross recognized that it was very decentralized, that there was some communication between the cells, but there clearly wasn't sort of a central authority. Again, that reflected the reality of it. And he also said, in terms of the dedication, quote, they were absolutely dedicated. They had committed themselves to this and to go to death in this cause. And in some ways, I think they would have been happy to have been killed in the cause in order to become sort of martyrs of the revolution. That he saw that as their potentially, that would have been their preferred outcome, because they recognized that they themselves weren't going to sort of create a free Quebec, a sort of socialist Quebec, that they were part of a process that hopefully they would, I mean, this is true of terrorists everywhere, that the idea of propaganda by deed, that it's not enough to use words, that actions are the things that eventually motivate others to also potentially carry out acts of violence and achieve some goal. Then there was the issue of the War Measures Act and how the kidnappers reacted to that. And again, I'm quoting Cross here. Their response to almost every reaction of the government in a legal sense, every police action was fascinating. It was to claim that this was contrary to British justice. And I found this the most amazing statement, and I kept on pointing it out to them, but they were most indignant about what they regarded as retroactive legislation, which they regarded as contrary to British justice. And he makes it clear that they did not anticipate the sort of response that the government did. And there's been work done, I believe by David Charters and others. There's an article called that calls them amateur terrorists, amateur revolutionaries, and this is one of the reasons why the FLQ persisted as long as it did, because it didn't have that sort of central authority, and there wasn't necessarily, I mean, they weren't necessarily hardened revolutionaries in terms of thinking through the consequences of violence and what course to follow and how to be most effective. And then there was how to Cross respond to his captivity. And he mentions, and quite poignantly in his comments, that it's simply a fact, I'm quoting here, that in the first 48 hours, I settled down and rationalized and thought out the consequences of death. And funnily enough, came to the conclusion I wasn't afraid of death. I was worried later on that they might strangle me, which of course is referencing Pierre Laporte, because Laporte was strangled. I didn't want to be strangled. I didn't seem to mind being shot, but I didn't really want to have a bit of wire around my neck and have it pulled tight. But I was worried all the time about was my wife, because what I was then particularly worried about was her financial situation. And I composed 2 letters in my mind only. One was a final testament to my wife's, saying, you know how much I loved her and everything. And the other was a letter to Mr. Trudeau, appealing to him to do something for her. And this was something that comes across in the document, that Cross was worried that his pension, that if he had been murdered, his pension would simply not have been enough to sustain his wife later in life. And this is one of his sort of recommendations in this conversation, is that government make sure that they do everything possible to help the families of kidnapped victims, that there's an obligation there to ensure that the families don't end up in poverty because of the breadwinner or an important member of the family losing their life in the service of duty. The other aspect of Cross's captivity, and again, this was part of his coping strategy, was his humor, and that he regularly joked with the kidnappers. I think the joking wasn't as extensive once Laporte was killed, but that he made jokes with him. And I think I love this anecdote. I've tweeted this before. I think this speaks to Cross's sense of humor. So he was joking with his kidnappers that once they had created a free, liberated Quebec, that they would be ministers in the government. And he said, quote, I made jokes about meeting them when they were ministers and receiving them in London and giving them diplomatic banquets, because I know, and this is the bit I love, because I know very well the British government would shake hands with anybody. All we need is time. The moment they arrive with a contract for 10 fighters, they would be received at Buckingham Palace. So it gives you a bit idea, his sort of cynical sense of humor. And then finally, there was his advice for future kidnapping victims. And he said quite bluntly that they should cooperate with the kidnappers. Quote, write whatever the kidnappers want you to write and never think that it will be held against you, because I think the first duty of the kidnappee is to stay alive. he can only do this by cooperation because his only value is as a cooperating hostage. And again, he added that it was really important for governments to support the families of kidnapped victims. And one of the main fears of his, again, was this idea that his wife would be left in poverty should he have been killed. So it's a fascinating insight, I think, into Cross's thinking at the time. If you look at the wider scholarship, some of the more recent work, I think it sort of is an accurate take on the nature of the FLQ, but also with some, continuing relevance in that, sadly, kidnappings continue to this day, diplomats being kidnapped, others being kidnapped. And yeah, I mean, it's was a really remarkable life of James Cross, very long life. And, despite effectively retiring shortly after this, he lived a long life. And so it's wonderful in the sense that we have this document that gives us the insight at the time as opposed to reflections decades later. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to call upon our next presenter, Patrick.
Right, good afternoon. I hope that's all working okay. I'll get started now. Thanks very much for, vraiment, merci beaucoup à Tony et Bax pour cette invitation. C'est la première fois que j'ai donné une présentation à Bax et c'est un privilège pour moi, c'est un honneur. Merci beaucoup. It's actually, I've been coming to Bax conferences since 1986, and unlike Steve, I don't think I've been to every single one, but it's really good to participate. I'm happy to reprise the talk I gave back in October. Just to say, I'm speaking in a personal capacity as a sort of long-standing friend of Canadian studies. I'm, as Tony says, a trained historian and a former lecturer in history. And some of my work does involve historical research, some quite contemporary, but I'm not giving any official history. I'm still a senior civil servant in the Foreign Office, and I want to underline that I fully respect there are continuing sensitivities that the October crisis can involve, particularly in Quebec. And I spent 5 years actually as Consul General in Montreal. And I made a point of not getting drawn into controversial historical debate. So I really don't want to start now. So I hope I can go ahead with that. But one thing which really strikes me is that the sensitivity on this issue is very one-sided, really. In the UK, I don't think the crisis is really very well remembered. As Steve has pointed out, since obviously we gave the talk, James Cross sadly died in January. And this got a lot of coverage in Canada and even some of the US papers, but very little in the UK, aside from a sort of full obituary in the Daily Telegraph of his career. And he was a civil servant over many years. Indeed, afterwards, I think he had 10 years or so rising to the level of Deputy Secretary in one of the home departments. My talk's based on most FCO papers now available at the National Archives. They also include actually not just the Foreign Office department papers back in London, but also the records of the British High Commission in Ottawa, which when I was on the desk a few years ago, we argued to preserve in their entirety and not be weeded or destroyed. So, and they almost all were opened in 2001 under the 30-year rule. There are a few documents which are closed. Today, I'm just going to, I'm really grateful to Steve because he's outlined pretty well the full story and the background, so I won't need to go into that. But what I will do is just have a look at how the British government reacted and the sort of various phases that went through as the crisis developed. And then if I've got a bit of time, I'll add some sort of personal reflections. As an official, I was both obviously Consul General, but as Tony said, I also served in Ottawa, in the High Commission in Ottawa. So as an official from two perspectives, how the sort of government handled the thing. Well, so I'll proceed now, just to give a little bit of context for the British attitude towards what they call the Quebec problem. I think since de Gaulle's famous Vive le Québec Libre declaration in Montreal in 1967, they've been given international attention to what was a small-scale but vocal independentist movement in Quebec. And reports from the British High Commission in the late 60s had increasingly examined political developments and what they referred to as the Quebec problem. And most of the political reporting of that time was prepared by the Chancery team at the High Commission in Ottawa. The British government office in Montreal was the largest outside Ottawa, but was primarily a trade office. And that's why Cross's title was Trade Commissioner. It wasn't Trade Commissioner for just Quebec, it was for Canada as a whole. In those days, they didn't call themselves Consul General, that came later on. It was very clear that by the 1970, concerns in the reports of the High Commission in Ottawa were mounting about the political situation. And Sir Colin Crowe, who was the British High Commissioner who was departing in September of 1970, in his valedictory dispatch, he noted the significance of, I quote, an avowedly separatist movement based on the belief that French Canadians will never find themselves unless freed from the Anglo-Saxon incubus. This, he thought, could develop into, in quotes, a threat to the very existence of Canada. But the files at the time contain very few references to the FLQ before October 1970, or to the series of small-scale terrorist incidents which had been occurring in Montreal in previous years. I don't think these were ignored, but they were not thought to be very significant. And at the time, obviously, there were lots of other more violent movements occurring in other parts of the world. And I thought the general perception was that Canada was a fairly peaceful, stable country, albeit with sort of live and active politics in Quebec. And it's interesting that after his release, Cross would later complain that he'd been given no information on or briefing about the FLQ before his posting, and the Foreign Office had to admit that they'd not done any research on the movement beforehand. I think the first period really is after Cross's kidnapping, which Steve's referred to. It's pretty clear the British High Commission in Ottawa was taken completely by surprise, and the immediate reports reflect some of the early confusion, what was going on. While they were waiting to learn who was claiming responsibility and what demands might be, the High Commission set up a small team in Ottawa to coordinate their response, and one or two individuals were sent up to Montreal, to the offices in Montreal, to be on the ground, trying to both deal with Barbara Cross, James Cross's wife, and also try to liaise with the Quebec authority, Canadian authorities in Montreal. When the Quebec government received the FLQ's demands on the afternoon of 5th of October, these were passed directly to the federal government in Ottawa, who instructed the Canadian High Commissioner in London, Charles Ritchie, to in turn pass these straight to number 10 by telephone at 10 o'clock that evening, 10 o'clock UK time. And as Steve has referred to, the FLQ threatened to kill Cross within 48 hours unless FLQ prisoners were released and flown to either Cuba or Algeria, and unless they were paid $500,000 in gold and the FLQ manifesto was published. Now, the number 10 in the evening of that night, the principal private secretary consulted urgently both the Prime Minister, Ted Heath, and the Foreign Secretary, Alec Douglas-Home. We have a record afterwards of the note for file, and it took 20 minutes or so before both Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary replied to the Canadian High Commission. And the note records two key points. Firstly, the British government had assumed the Canadian government were doing their utmost to secure the release of Mr. Cross. And then secondly, then on the information given, Her Majesty's government felt they could not ask the Canadian government to accept these terms. Now, the following morning, this was headline news in the UK and the first item on the cabinet agenda, the British cabinet agenda. And the Foreign Secretary suggested that the exorbitant demands, in quotes, exorbitant nature of the demands, in quotes, suggested the kidnappers were wholly irresponsible and therefore might not actually carry out their threats. But he noted in the rather dry manner of cabinet minutes that the FLQ had a reputation for violence and, in quotes, the possibility could not be disregarded that Mr. Cross's life might be in serious danger, unquote. So within first 24 hours of the incident, the UK government had taken a clear decision not to interfere directly in the crisis. They recognised Canadian government responsibility for handling the kidnapping and decided they would not press Ottawa to accede to the FLQ's demands. But this was a form of indirect diplomatic pressure. London would not press directly, but it would still made it clear that they expected Ottawa to work for Cross's relief. Now, this was a position they adhered to for the next 2 months, but there were times when the concerns for Cross's life placed a strain on this position and created some fluctuating tensions in London and between London and Ottawa. Now, as in all crises, there were periods of acute activity followed by periods of no activity, of lulls in activity. In the days before Laporte's kidnapping, all the attention was on the Cross situation. For the British High Commission and British diplomats in Montreal, it is clear that the first few days were very anxious as all sides tried to get a measure of the FLQ threats. It seemed the main source of background information on the FLQ was actually from the Canadian media. There are no reports or briefings on file that I could see from the RCMP or the Quebec Police given to the British High Commission. Throughout those first few days, the main themes were offering support for Barbara Cross from the staff of the Montreal Trade Office and the British High Commission. Mrs. Cross herself had not been hurt in the kidnapping, but was obviously badly shaken. And the main concern was to try and make sure that some indication for his wife that Cross was still alive was provided. And there's some puzzlement, I think, is a polite word to put it, when the indications that there was a note from Cross to pass to his wife was to be kept secret, although then it found it was actually being reported already in the Montreal press. So there was a lot of strain on Barbara Cross's situation, quite understandably, and there was a lot of time and attention paid to her. There was also back in London some parts of the civil service that were pressing privately for more to be done, including, rather remarkably, the Foreign Office's Diplomatic Staff Association, which is the FCO's trade union, even though actually Cross himself was not a member of the diplomatic service. He was an official of the Department Board of Trade, Trade Commission, slightly separate service and at this stage, later combined in the 70s. But they lobbied, as had the permanent secretary of the Board of Trade, who was pressing the Foreign Office that the Canadians were not doing enough to release him. The British High Commission Ottawa also considered how they might improve the flow of information. A British Security Service liaison officer from the British Embassy in Washington flew up to Ottawa on the 6th of October, and he joined the RCMP Operations Centre for planning and discussion with the federal task force monitoring the situation. But in a secret report of 9th of October, which is now released, he advised that his presence in Ottawa was not essential, and the best avenue would be to encourage the RCMP to step up their capability at the combined anti-terrorist headquarters in Montreal, rather than having a British police or security liaison officer in Montreal. So overall, in these first few days, the British officials seemed reasonably reassured by the Canadian handling, and were impressed by their readiness to offer minor concessions to the demands, for example, agreeing to broadcast the FLQ statement. They were also, I think this had been kept in private, that they're particularly impressed that the Quebec Minister of Justice, Jérôme Choquette, had said he was ready to offer safe passage in return for Cross's release. Now, at the time, that was quite an unprecedented offer in a hostage situation to agree to consider that. Now, the first few days obviously were confusing But I think the kidnapping of Laporte on the 10th of October, you really got a sense of turning a serious kidnapping situation into a much more serious political crisis for Quebec and the Canadian government. So until the 10th of October, the main focus was on the fate of the British diplomat. And that remained the focus of the British team in Montreal and the High Commissioner in Ottawa. But they also had to explain to London an increasingly complicated political context. And I think it's surprising that the few days between Laporte's kidnapping and, as Steve has alluded to, the declaration of the War Measures Act, it doesn't really convince a sense of the mounting national crisis. I think British diplomats were preoccupied with trying to get reports about Cross, keeping the focus on Cross itself. But there are a few hints of increasing tensions within the High Commission and London a little bit. On the 13th of October, the American Department of the Foreign Office, where the Canada desk is situated, produced a briefing for the UK cabinet. And I think it reflected a hardening attitude about the FLQ, calling their leaders well organized and trained, but in quotes, revolutionary psychopaths of a particularly unpleasant and dangerous kind, unquotes, with some links to international left-wing groups. The calmer appraisal was echoed in a reporting telegram for the High Commission on the 13th of October. It judged that the federal and provincial governments had worked satisfactorily together and that the two governments' approach of carefully calibrated small concessions but no compromise on the central demands seemed to be working. They still felt at that time there was a prospect of dialogue of sorts. But the picture changes on the 15th of October. I think the first indication of the more serious political mood in Montreal was the report on the declaration by René Lévesque, a leader of the PQ, the Quebec unions, and most notably Claude Ryan, the in quotes, much respected editor of Le Devoir. And the telegram from the British High Commission, Ottawa, describes the PQ move fairly critically as a, quote, rather distasteful piece of party political maneuvering to embarrass the Bourassa government. But they noted that the signatories of people like Ryan could be more significant. If public opinion in Quebec was influenced by this type of statement and led to a general wave of dissatisfaction with the government's hard line, there could, in quotes, be difficult times ahead. Well, the difficult times came very quickly. And on the 15th of October, the Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, wrote to Ted Heath to explain or to indicate that they were going to take further actions. He justified this by saying that he had to act to prevent the undermining of the foundations of government and law in this country, Canada, where, quotes, the integrity of our political and legal system is being seriously challenged. He forewarned Heath that the Canadian government would have to take further actions and use all the powers and resources we can muster to end the terror to which this group would subject their captives and the Canadian people. Now, this confirmed from the Foreign Office in London the rumours that the War Measures Act was to be introduced. On the 15th of October, the Canada desk officer in the Foreign Office, Rowena Vining, produced a copy of this rarely reduced legislation for her head of department and summarised the main points. She added an astute observation that, in quotes, this is a pretty desperate legal expedient, and even though it is clearly done with the agreement of the Quebec government, it will lead to great bitterness among French Canadians. The High Commission in Ottawa was given more details ahead of the statement on the 16th of October, and the High Commission judged the statement very tough and noted that arrests were already taking place that morning. With national events moving fast, it not lost sight of the concern for Barbara Cross. There were some internal discussions about, again, about the FLQ and why the British government had not been informed about threats which had been given to the American and Israeli consuls earlier in the year. And there was also picking up more discussions of Canadian contacts with the Algerian government about whether they could receive them. But the dramatic period of 24 hours, I think, between the declaration of the War Measures Act and the discovery of Laporte's body, it didn't leave much time for in-depth reporting. But you do get a sense of some of the alarm, and there was real concern when they heard of Laporte's death that Cross had also been killed. And indeed, there were some media reports immediately that he had been killed, although that was quickly discounted. But there's still, there's one report which calls it, it's rather disquieting is the term used to rather understatement, I think, in that. But it clearly was a turning point in the crisis, and it meant that public opinion in Quebec and the rest of Canada swung firmly behind Trudeau. And that really enters a third period into which the new British High Commissioner, Peter Heyman, arrived in Ottawa on the 17th of October, sorry, same day as Laporte's body was found. And these are tense times where Heyman himself has to try and take charge. And there's lots of conflicting reports from the media of what's going on. There's clearly concern about the situation in Ottawa as well. And there's a warning on file of a note from the new High Commissioner to the staff in the High Commission in Ottawa to be extremely guarded about any comments about the UK government's attitude to the way the federal and Quebec governments were dealing with the case. He warned that there's an obvious tactic to try and break up the solidarity of the British and Canadian governments, and that he felt that this would add materially to the danger to which Mr. Cross is exposed. There's a very interesting record of Heyman's introductory meeting with Trudeau on the 22nd of October, and there's two issues come of this. One is they considered carefully the idea of a humanitarian appeal on Cross's behalf, maybe from Barbara Cross herself. And Trudeau was resistant to this. He felt that such an appeal would be regarded as evidence of weakness by the FLQ, and he did not believe it would achieve its objectives. So Ottawa was not going to concede on that. The second one was Trudeau's comments trying to reassure that he was personally a little bit more optimistic for Cross's chances. He argued that if the FLQ had murdered Cross but kept Laporte alive, this would have put overwhelming pressure on the Quebec government to give way and led to a direct clash with the federal government. So the FLQ did not do this was either a miscalculation on their part or evidence that the cell holding Cross did not intend to murder Cross. Now, this is an interesting example of Trudeau's sort of Cartesian way of thinking, and it is somewhat self-serving, but this gradually became the consensus view in London that perhaps what had happened to Laporte was not going to happen to Cross. And then over the next few weeks, the big concern was that if Cross's whereabouts were found and there was some attempt to liberate him, then this could end in a confrontation and shooting. And in that way, there may be more concerns. So throughout this, the next few weeks, and it does drag on for some while, the British government did not want to appear to be backseat driving operations, but there's more active engagement from the team, as the first secretary from the head of Chancellery from High Commission Ottawa is a man called Lord Don Russell, is working in Montreal. He has interactions with the Montreal police force. There's a security liaison. There's a visit from the head of MI5, MI5, who goes out to Ottawa on the 9th of November to talk to the Canadian government. I think that's pre-planned visit, and it's not looking to interfere, but it's to try and get some more information on the position. So by the 3rd of December, they've already had information from the Montreal police and from the RCMP of the release that they found Cross, and there are then diplomatic discussions behind the scenes about the terms under which Cross would be released, of the handover which was going to occur, and the British High Commission representative Don Russell is up, made sure he's on present to make sure that Cross is handed over okay. And so let me just finish. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit. Look, I mean, as I said, I did both jobs, both in Ottawa and Montreal, and it's rather strange to imagine myself in that situation, to be honest. But from a modern perspective, a number of things really strike me. One, how few were the number of officials actually involved in this decision-making process. Nowadays, there'd be a huge number of COBRA meetings and dozens of officials and everyone set up. It's kept to a very small number, and it's very clear decisions were made, very sort of narrow track of decisions being taken. But I do think from a UK perspective, I think probably it was the right decision not to try to backseat drive the Canadian or Quebec governments. It probably wouldn't have worked, and it would have caused resentment. So there was no, and Steve's alluded to this a little bit, there was no really established policy of handling kidnappings, and it wasn't, there had been some guidance, but it hadn't really been applied. So this event helped crystallize a sort of more serious approach to how to handle these sorts of events. Thankfully, not very often. As for the British government's view, the High Commission, I mean, they looked at it and I think they felt Trudeau came out of it very strongly. His firm handling of the crisis had boosted his political support across the country, but the High Commission Ottawa team did look at the longer term consequences and warned that the heavy-handed intervention would be a boost for the separatist movement in the longer term. And there's their judgment, even if, as proved correct, there was no public support in Quebec for the use of violent means to achieve this. Right, okay, apologies, Tony, I've gone a little bit long, but I hope that's covered it. I'll stop now.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to call upon the final presenter in this portion of the BACS conference, Carrie Morgan.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much. Like the others, I'm delighted to be having a second opportunity to speak about this work, which I think, as the other panelists have suggested, is also, for my part, very much a work in progress. I should also acknowledge that the research for it was originally supported by a British Academy small research grant, and I'm very grateful for that. So this paper then is prompted by an ongoing interest in the tensions around memorializations of a crisis, which many have said they would rather forget. For example, in a special issue of the journal Quebec Studies to mark its 20th anniversary, Louise H. Forsyth describes October 1970 as, and I quote, "a traumatic moment of lost innocence," end of quote. In a book published the same year, Jean-François Cardin figures the moment as a kind of half-suppressed, pained memory. Et je cite, Octobre 1970 a été pendant plusieurs années un véritable sujet tabou dont on hésitait à parler comme pour s'éviter quelques souvenirs. Fin de citation. So these comments then as to the very raw nature of the subject contrast with the considerable cultural and public interest it has generated. So whilst it's possible to talk of the October Crisis novel as a genre, and indeed I've got a chapter on it in my book on the Montreal novel, Mindscapes. So despite this, then there are nevertheless real differences in the way the crisis is represented in novels in French and English and at different periods in time. So unlike English language novels of the 1970s, which vary in their forms, genres and modes, ranging from documentary realism to pulp fiction, a clear set of conventions is identifiable in French language novels of the decade. Whilst a number of these echo the Manichean mapping of Montreal that we get in the neo-nationalist writing of the 1960s, this tends to be accompanied by a move away from the hyper-realist style of what came subsequently to be known as le texte national. By and large, the French language October Crisis novel of the 1970s is non-realist. And this is the case in spite of the fact that one or two of the novel covers, such as Pierre Ladouceur's L'Escalade, published in 1971, reproduce photographic images of the events, suggesting a verisimilitude between narrative and history. This aesthetic shift marks a contrast with some English language novels of the period, notably Brian Moore's The Revolution script, published in 1971, which has been compared with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood for its documentary style. And of course, we can attribute this move away from realism to broader literary and cultural trends, including feminism and l'écriture au féminin, counterculture, and the kinds of experimental writing associated with modernité. All the same, the non-realist turn of 1970s French language October Crisis novels seems surprising in some ways, given that the lives of a number of writers, and others of course, were impacted quite significantly by the events. So as is well known, some were arrested, such as Gérard Gaudin and Gaston Mirand, and others subject to police searches, such as Paul Chamberlain and Jacques Ferrand, who later famously acted as intermediary between the authorities and the Chenier cell. So following from the 1970s, then there's a good deal of variation in October Crisis novels and creative writing. And it's not easy to speak of a coherent body of texts beyond their shared thematic concerns. Many of the novels written in French and English take up narratives of betrayal, notably following the revelation of the presence of high-ranking informers in the FLQ, such as Carole Devaux, following the Keele Commission hearings. There's less of a distinction in novels written in French and English, and both sometimes represent the October Crisis as a backdrop to a romance narrative. The sexy felkiste is a bit of a recurring figure in some of this work. One very interesting feature to me is that several authors return repeatedly to the theme. And these authors include Jacques Ferrand, who wrote about the crisis almost obsessively in his Historiettes, short political stories, which repeatedly underscore his belief that the October Crisis was a federal conspiracy. Other writers to have represented the crisis more than once include Anne Legault and Pierre Turgeon, whose Un Dernier Blues pour Octobre, published in 1990, is much closer to Moore's The Revolution script, published almost 20 years previously, than to Turgeon's own very stylish postmodern suburban noir, Prochainement sur cet écran, published in 1973. Today, though, I'm speaking about a very unusual, I think, literary memorialization of the crisis, namely film director Carlo Blanc's creative nonfiction work, Le Personnage Secondaire, published in 2006. As its title suggests, the focus of the book is James Cross, the person who, as both Steve and Patrick have highlighted, who was at the heart of the crisis, has nevertheless often been sidelined in representations of and retrospectives on October 1970. Not surprisingly, such retrospectives have tended to center around Pierre Laporte. Leblanc observes, en ne mourant pas, je cite, en ne mourant pas, Cross était disqualifié. So by remaining alive, then in some way Cross has became a bit of a kind of encumbrance or a non-person, secondary or supporting character. Besides surviving the crisis, then, one factor which Le Personnage Secondaire figures as contributing to Cross's being a supporting rather than a leading character is his Britishness. Although the book highlights time and again the ambivalent identity of the Irishman born in pre-independence Tipperary. For example, during an interview with Leblanc, Jacques Langto, one of Cross's former kidnappers, remarks, je cite, il, c'est-à-dire Cross, était calme, sympathique, un gentleman. Et puis c'est un Irlandais, il n'espérait rien de la reine. On ne pouvait tout de même pas le libérer et trouver un authentique Britannique. Fin de citation. So other factors then, which le personnage secondaire figures as contributing to the supposedly supporting status of its purported main character, include the cross was not the FLQ's original target, but chosen after the attempt to kidnap the US Consul General Harrison Burgess failed. Cross's relative silence on the crisis in the years following his release, and crucially, the former Trade Commissioner's age at the time Leblanc is researching his project. So although it stands as a work in its own right, Le Personnage Secondaire is a reflection on the documentary Leblanc sets about making following the 30th anniversary of October 1970. And this gives another layer of meaning to the title of what is, in many respects, a cinematic piece of writing. Leblanc's book is structured like a film, with establishing shots of a rather exoticized English pastoral, flashbacks, imaginary reconstructions of events from Cross's past, such as the 1946 bombing at the King David Hotel, Steve alluded to it earlier, at which Cross was present, and insertions of key documents or extracts from key documents written during the crisis. And these include FLQ communiqués, letters from James and Barbara Cross, Pierre Laporte, and also government statements. These various texts then frame and disrupt the chronological narrative of Leblanc's account of meetings with the Cross family in Seaford and meetings with other key individuals, consultation of archival material at Keele. This is prior to the release of the more recent material, of course, and film funding and negotiations. Le Personnage Secondaire offers a sympathetic portrayal of Cross, who in 2001 describes himself to Leblanc as hating his kidnappers as much as 30 years previously, since they'd made his family suffer so much. The book yields some fascinating insights, such as the day-to-day of hostage life. Cross recollects eating peanut butter on toast more and more often as the weeks went on, and his kidnappers' financial resources dwindled. There are also references to key meeting places, such as the now defunct Le Chat Noir, which, along with La Haute Suisse, was a hangout for many Felkistes and members of Montreal's underground. And the city's underground then included countercultural writers like Patrick Strauram and José Yvon, whose later novel, the 1990 Les Laids Otages, alludes to the crisis. It's very interesting and little remarked inscription of the October crisis. It describes one of its female characters as almost having been an unwitting participant in the events after she dated a young historian, likely a reference to Robert Caumont. Leblanc's film, which the Cross family are described as agreeing to as, je cite, notre seul et dernier mot sur cette histoire, highlights time and again the mundanity, albeit characterized by a certain degree of wealth and privilege, of Cross and his family, drawing attention to the familiar curation of everyday domestic intimacies in various photographs, home movies, and letters. This mundanity is highlighted in reflection Leblanc makes after consulting archival material newly released to the public. Je cite, j'espérais John le Carré, je suis donc Virginia Woolf. Le Personnage Secondaire has some elements in common with Michael Winterbottom's Tristram Shandy, a cock and bull story made in 2006. But rather than being a film about an unfilmable book, it's a book about an unfilmable film. Besides wondering how one can make a film that people want to see about memories, Leblanc makes repeated reference to the fact the Cross is not really movie material. Je cite, il n'a pas beaucoup de qualité médiatique. This is due to his personality, described by Leblanc as a non-star persona, and I would argue then also his training. The book's insistence on Leblanc as a Cross as a supporting actor is also linked, of course, to the life stage of the former commissioner. The repeated reflections on Cross's appearance and pastimes seen as typical of a retiree, especially an English one, as well as his advanced years. Indeed, whilst Leblanc describes the project as operating in a resurrection of someone most people assume dead, réapparition de Cross, le personnage secondaire also cast itself as a kind of epitaph, and reading the book almost 20 years on from the research charted within it prompts a reflection on changing attitudes to aging over the last decades. 79 no longer seems as ancient as it appears to do so to Leblanc, as well as very curious sensation that comes with knowing that Cross was to live for a further 20 years from the period, or almost 20 years from the period charted in the text. In several respects, then, le personnage secondaire becomes a reflection on documentary filmmaking, with the narrator recognizing at one point, je cite, il me faut bien admettre que je suis un prédateur. Leblanc represents himself as disrupting the peaceful later life of James and Barbara Cross, bringing back to the surface memories which the couple and their daughter Susan would rather suppress. Le personnage secondaire offers a perspective on the crisis which I think would have been unthinkable in the years immediately following it. This is suggested by the various clashes depicted by the narrator author and other cultural producers or commentators who are a generation older than Leblanc. I haven't yet managed to see Leblanc's documentary, L'Otage, made in 2004, but the film, and that is the resulting film from the work with the Cross family. But the film did win Le Prix Historia for the best documentary of that year. Creative non-fiction has become more established since the publication of Leblanc's book, and in some ways we can see Le Personnage Secondaire as an example of what Laura Decisionmaking describes as, and I quote, critical autobiography, end of quote, despite its object of studies. It tells us as much about Leblanc as it does about Cross. By the end of the book, Cross becomes, to some degree, the supporting character to the author narrator, who admits was mentally preparing a speech about his imagined, yet to be made film, J'ai des rêves de grandeur. To conclude, rather tentatively, much of the literary production on the October crisis of the 1970s, particularly French language fiction, suggests through its use of form the moment is difficult and shameful for many who came of age during the Quiet Revolution. Thereafter, the fictional and literary treatments of the crisis largely feature the event as backdrops to other narratives, and these are typically romance or thriller. I've just been reading recently Giles Blunt's The Delicate Storm, a murder mystery, which reprises some of the events. Memoirs produced by those involved in the October crisis frequently have a consciousness-raising function, serve as confessionals, partly produced for financial reasons, I'm thinking of Devoe's confessional here, or témoignage, or as self-styled correctives of political fact. The 50th anniversary has, of course, sparked a flurry of new and revised editions of memoirs and histories, such as Louise Langto's Une sorcière comme les autres, originally published in 1981, republished under the title of Une sorcière parmi les felkistes. Guy Lachapelle's Le devoir et la crise d'octobre, ou Le combat de journalistes démocrates, which echoes the title, of course, of Claude Ryan's 1971 book, and Robert Comeau's own memoir, Mon octobre 70, La crise et ses suites. Part biography, part social history, part memoir, the personnage secondaire occupies a very strange and interesting position amongst all this writing, nevertheless contributing to the uncomfortable memorialization of a key historical moment in Quebec, Canada, and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. We are going to move on to our question and answer period at this time. You are welcome to type your questions into the comment section, into the chat rather, here on Zoom. I see one raised hand. There was, I'll get to you in just a moment, Gareth. There was a question typed into the chat here from Rachel. Rachel, would you like to ask your question? Glenn, if you can.
Rachel, I believe you're unmuted now.
Yeah, hi. It was just a quick question, just to ask about, is there any record of how he felt about the King David Hotel? And whether James Cross made any kind of links in any of his conversations between the two experiences, or were they completely different in his head? That was just, of course.
Yeah. I sent you a private message, Rachel, with the actual quote about the King David Hotel, but he used it in the context. Yeah, he did it in the context.
I think it's over there, as I can see.
He did it in the context of comparing the FLQ to Irgun, to the Stern gang that were involved. And he just said, I was in Palestine in '46 in the King David Hotel when it was blown up, so I have some experience of this. They would regard themselves in the role of either the Stern gang and the Irgun by forcing the situations which arise. So he was trying to contextualize the FLQ. And he didn't offer any other reflection on this remarkable fact that he was at the hotel when it was blown up.
No, and it didn't help his reactions at all in the situation he was in.
Yeah, that was the only reference to it, and they didn't pursue it in the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rachel. The next question goes to Gareth Davis.
Thanks very much, Christina. Thanks, guys, for great papers. My question is directed to Steve. Steve, you situated the crisis very clearly in the period in which it took place. I was just intrigued by your broader work, which is on terrorism in Canada, and I just wondered if you could give us some idea of how this crisis intersects with or diverges from broader strains of terrorism in Canada.
There you go. That is a great question. I think, I mean, in a couple of ways. One is obviously the tactics used, the kidnappings, which were, there had been kidnappings not in Canada, but elsewhere of diplomats in the late 60s. So in that sense, it wasn't new what they were doing. And they were obviously getting ideas from elsewhere. I mean, obviously there's the longer history as well. You know, the bombings going back to 63, and this was a long campaign. So in that sense, that was somewhat unique, although again, you had groups like the Doukhobors who carried out bombings in British Columbia literally over decades, you know, earlier in the 20th century. I think what's remarkable to a certain extent is actually their state response more than the violence itself. You know, the invoking of the War Measures Act, the curtailment of civil liberties, the mass arrests of people. And it's really interesting because the counterterrorism force, the RCMP, actually recommended against the invoking of the War Measures Act. And I think that speaks to some of the interpretations by people like Reg Whittaker and others, that this was more of a political response and sending a message to the wider Quebec populace than it was anything to do with going after the FLQ. So in that sense, I think there's a legacy there in terms of the state response that we can still see, obviously, since 9/11 with this, the danger of sort of overreacting to terrorism. I mean, it was just two small groups of individuals. And I think that was something actually Cross reflected on in his transcript, that the power of these individuals, so two small groups of individuals who do this kidnapping and are on the front page of world newspapers, and how powerful and how intoxicating that can be. And I think that's the lesson today to politicians, the danger of overreacting, which is exactly what terrorists want. They want an overreaction. They want a crackdown on civil liberties. They want to alienation of the wider population, because it leads to recruits, it leads to wider support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The next question goes to Vicky.
Hello. My question is addressed to Dr. Hewitt, but I guess any panelists could answer as well. Since you mentioned that Mr. Cross was of Irish origin, I was wondering if he ever made some sort of comparisons between the Irish struggles for independence and the FLQ motivations for Quebec's future.
Just unmute. He didn't. He did reference a novel written about the Irish Civil War in the 1920s, which I will look it up and I will post the reference. But he didn't explicitly make a connection between the two. But then I don't know, maybe the other two panelists know if he ever did make reference to that. Thanks for the question.
Should I come in, Christina? The short answer is no, Steve's right. I've not seen very much on that. The sort of Irish side to his background is interesting. It does actually come up in some of the internal documentation, because I think his brother, whose name I now forget, was Irish, living in Ireland, and he had written to the Irish ambassador in London, I think, to try and sort of make a lobby to emphasize Cross's Irish connections, and therefore that he shouldn't be treated as a sort of imperialist British diplomat. And I think his brother also had gone public at a couple of times, which had not gone down very well, I think, within the British government. That thought was it was going to complicate matters. So if you like, the sort of Irish side of his background wasn't something that was emphasized, I don't think. And I think he'd gone to Trinity College Dublin, I think, as his first degree was there, but I don't think he'd lived in Ireland. I don't think he had, apart from his brother and family, there were active connections there at the time.
Thank you.
In Leblanc's book, Leblanc kind of describes himself as, or recounts him trying to push James Cross to making some kind of comparison, or to see if there are any innate emotional sympathies, because he was an Irishman originally, and Cross just refuses to play that, to go there. He just sort of says, "You kidding, really?" It's not. He just refuses to be drawn on the matter.
Great, thanks everyone for weighing in on that question. The next question goes to Grant Myers.
Yes, hi. I thought maybe I wouldn't have to actually put the question up myself, but I thought I could just get away with putting it in the text. I'd be interested to understand what the speakers make of the many recent attempts, I would suggest, in some areas of Quebec, of the Quebec media and popular culture, to generate sympathy for the FLQ and gloss over what we would understand as terrorist actions. And I would put La Famille Rose as an example of that, just based on my own viewing.
I'm not sure I really feel I can fully respond to that question. I'll just say that, I mean, I've only seen a bit of La Famille Rose, which is, of course, made by the son, isn't it, of one of the, as the son or the nephew of one of the Rose brothers. So that obviously will, shape the way the text might look. All I can say is that I gave a public talk on October Crisis novels of the 1970s in Montreal during my time at McGill in 2007. And I had many Francophone friends who sort of said, we don't talk about that time. That is a shameful time in our history. So I'm wondering if there's something also about generational differences, periods of time passing, different responses to it. As I've said, certainly in terms of my own research, representations in literature, at least, notably in fiction, that are close to the period often have a real unease around dealing with or mediating the topic.
Can I can I just say, Christine, there's a slightly political edge to that question, so it might be a bit difficult for Patrick to answer. So it might be easier for Steve if you want to.
Sure, I think it's highly problematic, actually, and I know there was a politician in Quebec, Solidaire, that sort of was again part of sort of glamorizing. But I have to say that there's also a complete double standard in terms of how we view state violence, and we tend to legitimize state violence and delegitimize violence by non-state actors. And I think both approaches are problematic, and we need to remember that states are responsible for much more violence than non-state actors. And so there's also a double standard, inherent in the way that we approach this kind of violence versus the violence that's carried out by states all the time through military or even through police forces.
Actually, Tony, I'll try not to avoid creating too much controversy. But just I think in Cross's own words later on, he is certainly critical of his kidnappers and saying that they expressed no remorse or regret for what had happened. And he's certainly not ready to sort of forgive and forget at all. I think in all his interviews subsequently, he's fairly firm on that and has very strong views on that. But what I would say, and trying not to be controversial, is that this was the end of the FLQ. It was never a force afterwards, and none of the individuals, some of whom served prison sentences, advocated violence after that. There are other political movements elsewhere and terrorist movements we know where people continue to advocate sort of violent means. And so I think there are two sides to it, although, again, don't want to get myself in hot water.
Thank you, Patrick. We're going to move on to the next question, and that would be Francesca. It's okay for your camera, Francesca. You can just voice your question.
Yes, thank you. I have a rather old laptop, so the webcam doesn't seem to work. Yeah, thank you for the talks. They're all really interesting. I had a question for Steve, particularly. Are you aware of any, did the incident have any sort of noticeable impact on the US in terms of the way that they dealt with terrorism? And also, for example, the Nixon administration at the time, was it a big incident in the US, or was it not really kind of considered, did they not really pay much, any sort of attention to it? Was it just seen as, well, that's in Canada, it doesn't really affect us?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. Not that I'm aware of. There were certainly issues. There were wider concerns on part of the Canadian state and also obviously on part of the FBI about connections between the Black Panthers and the FLQ. And so that was obviously something was at the forefront in terms of the US, because the US obviously had considerably more violence going on in the 1960s and the latter half of the 1960s than did Canada. And there was real concern, the highest levels of the Canadian government by the early 1970s, that law and order might completely collapse in the US, and what implications would that have for Canada? So in that sense, this is kind of small potatoes compared to what's happening in the US. And in terms more broadly, the bigger terrorist incident is what happens in Munich in September 1972. That's where terrorism becomes a priority in the US and in many other countries, including Canada, in terms of international terrorism with the attack at the Olympics.
Okay, thank you.
Just I can come in just briefly. There is a released American intelligence report from about 1972 or so, which I came across on the internet. I promise you, it was not giving any privileged information out, which analysed the response of the Canadian authorities to the incident. And it sort of gets into the terrorist literature or counter-terrorist literature as an example of a very successful, tough response by the authorities to clamp down on a burgeoning terrorist movement. Now, actually, if you know more about it, it was handled, although it was very tough, the actual negotiations, the hostage negotiations, were handled very carefully and did allow for a release of the prisoners, release of the prisoners, and the kidnappers actually got away. And now that was not followed. And in the future counter-terrorist responses was never give in to hostage takers in meeting demands like that. So I think some mixed lessons were learned, and maybe not always the right ones.
Just to add to that, it's the Nixon administration that comes out with it. Nixon comes out with the no concessions policy, and that's in response to U.S. diplomats being kidnapped who were then subsequently murdered. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. The next, it's a comment actually from Matthew Farfan.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a short comment. I want to thank the various speakers for the interesting perspectives each of them has brought to what has remained a seminal, mythical, quite infamous event here in Quebec, even to this day. For many people of my generation, coincidentally, I was born on Jim Cross's birthday. I learned that today. For people of my generation, this remains, I guess, their coming of political consciousness. It's the first political event that I can remember. I was born in '64. Certainly the first extremist political event. In my particular case, Pierre Laporte was he was a near neighbor of ours in St. Lambert. And as a young kid, I can remember clearly the heavily armed police presence in front of the house. This was quite a striking thing for a young kid. I was particularly impressed by the assault rifles. It's interesting to hear some of the comments of how perceptions of this incident changed over the years, and how it has been portrayed in recent days in various films and other media. For me, it will always, I guess, remain in my consciousness as the cause for Halloween being canceled that year. There was no trick-or-treating, but also the heinous and cowardly murder of an innocent family man. So I think that we tend to forget that fact, at least with the Pierre Laporte side of it, the consequences that political ideology can have on people that are caught up in it. Anyway, thank you for the presentations. It was very interesting.
Thanks for sharing that, Matthew. We're going to move on to the next question from James, I believe.
Hi. So thanks for 3 great papers. Just to follow up on something Steve said, I think it was Gerard Peltier, Trudeau's great friend and supporter, who, when he was shown that list of arrestees, that Trudeau, I think, showed him, he looked down the list and didn't see a single FLKiste on that list, so it just, he knew immediately it was an overreaction. There was no one on that list that was an FLKiste, so I think, that comes from Peltier. So that, I mean, kind of interesting. Steve mentioned in his presentation that kind of local aspect that certainly reflects the views of the FLKistes themselves, the sort of particular interpretation of Quebec's history and influence from Algeria and Cuba. But I just wondered about the wider context in Quebec itself. I mean, with deep irony, the progressive changes that were taking place throughout the 1960s that someone like Pierre Laporte was so much a part of the Quiet Revolution in instigating these progressive changes that were taking place. I just wonder about the degree to which there was an understanding that there was those rising expectations that were being created in the 60s were in some ways part of what was behind the the FLQ, and maybe in particular to Patrick, just the extent to which the British authorities in their dispatches had any kind of, were viewing, how they were viewing these wider changes that were bringing forth a kind of new thinking in political circles in Quebec, and certainly leading to the wider independence movement, not the narrow groups of the FLQ, but to the Parti Québécois, but also the groups that had grown, the PQ had grown out of, include like the RIN or the RN and so on. I just also wanted to ask Carrie about whether part of the sources she looked at, including, I think it was Pierre Falardeau and his movie on October from the 1990s, which I think it looks specifically at the Chénier group within the FLQ and the murder of Pierre Laporte. I wonder if that was part of her work. So thanks, guys, for great papers.
Do you want me to go first, Christina?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Sure. No, thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, look, there was an, obviously in the middle of a crisis, it's a bit hard to sort of stand back and sort of set it in context. I mean, I've done political reporting myself, and it's not easy sometimes. But yeah, I think there was an appreciation of changing political pressures within Quebec society from the late 60s onwards. And of course, in 1970, there's a provincial election, which, all right, Basta gets in and the Liberals back in power, but the PQ ran for the first time as a serious political entity, and I think come in third place, but quite a strong response. And I think that's recognized that that's a growing force, an appeal to younger people, and a particular analysis of the impact of the economic situation, which, I mean, when thinks of the late 60s and 70s, it was a relatively good period for the Canadian economy, for global economy. But actually, there were economic problems, growing unemployment in Quebec and Montreal, decline of some of the older industries. So a sense that the PQ would be able to exploit both the sort of nationalistic aspirations of a younger generation, and also the economic unhappiness and uncertainties. So I think they did set that in, but I don't think they felt the FLQ represented that sort of wider feeling. They thought the sense was that this was a very small group of pretty extreme individuals, and that overall the sort of aspirations for indépendentisme was more democratic and political rather than sort of terrorist oriented.
Thank you, Patrick. Was there anyone else who wanted to weigh in on James's question before we move on? No, okay. The next question goes to David Hutchinson.
David, you have to let me unmute you. I think you're good now.
I just did, yeah.
Okay, right. The thing about kidnappers and the people they kidnap is relationships can develop. And Mr. Cross was kidnapped for quite some time. And I just wondered, it's a question really for Steve, is there any evidence in the debriefing that took place as to what exactly they talked about? I mean, what did they do all day, over that long period of time? What was the kind of personal interaction during his kidnapping period?
Yeah, they certainly, there is that discussion. I mean, Cross mentioned that his French wasn't great. So, I mean, there was lots of, I think they had the television on all the time. So he was listening on the radio, and he was listening to some of the coverage. and occasionally would have conversations with some of the kidnappers, but often he was sort of following them somewhat slowly. And the interactions, I believe he says, largely ended after the Laporte was murdered. It became sort of much more serious then. But yeah, I mean, just joking around at times. And I mean, they assured him sort of almost at the beginning of the kidnapping that they didn't have any intention of killing him. But he took that with a grain of salt, because he said that, you know, if it came to the police storming the house, he was liable to get killed in the crossfire. Or if it was a case that they needed to get away, it would be much easier for them to dispose of him than try to take him along, or they'd be worried that he might, you know, identify them or help the police track them down. So they did reassure him, but yeah, but he had concerns about that. But generally, he got on with several of the kidnappers, not I think one or two or one of the female kidnappers. He had some harsh words for, but I think Carrie might know more about that, because I know she's done some work on that.
Thank you.
Well, Leblanc cites Cross as critiquing Louise Langto for her particularly hardline attitude on a number of occasions, and I think that's supported in some of the other documentation of that period, and also in Louise Langto's own memoirs. She, this is be no surprise to anyone who's worked on women terrorists or militants, describes the kind of sexism experienced by herself and some of her other female activists, not all of whom were in the FLQ, of course, but so I think even Cross speculates within or is described as speculating within the Leblanc text, that perhaps some of her very hardline attitude was about compensate or trying to make a place in what was otherwise seen as a man's world in some ways.
Can I just come in briefly, just to check with Steve? I think I'm right in saying, Steve, that for Cross himself, the mood changes when he hears of Laporte's death. He hears the reports on television, and I think that's a sort of kind of changing link in the relationship with his kidnappers, which I think he tried to maintain a sort of reasonable dialogue and keep it as friendly as possible. But I think maybe, Steve, you said earlier that he was also very concerned that he still had a blindfold on quite a bit of the time. So he couldn't actually see them. He couldn't sort of see their face. He didn't want to, obviously, because he realized if he recognized them, that they would feel that they would never be able to release him. So it's quite a tension that's sort of very powerful. And I think the last few weeks, there's clearly not much of an interaction between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was facing forward, and they would always speak to him from behind. And yeah, you're right. I mean, and I mentioned earlier about his concern about being strangled. I mean, that obviously is a direct reference to what happened to Laporte.
Thanks, everyone. We have just a couple of minutes left. There's a final question from Bart Zielinski.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I unmuted myself now. Hello. Thank you. Well, thanks for a wonderful panel. Yeah, I do realize we're running out of time. Thanks for the interconnectedness of the panel as well. I think that worked really, really well. And in the study of the representation of the events in literature with the study of structural violence, if we will, and the diplomacy, I think that really opened up the question in a multi-layeredness that is really fascinating to view it in. I suppose my question is also somewhat structural, even though there are time constraints. I'm just wondering, because the events can be viewed as revolutionary events, or the movement as a revolutionary movement, Leninist, Marxist, and then Lenin writing about imperialism and so forth. So, well, before a revolution that actually materialized and it was successful. Now, this was one that wasn't successful. So maybe very briefly, could you maybe just maybe say a few words how you know, this, how we can interpret the literature in that context. So if there is a linearity which, you know, leads to a revolution or to independence, which hasn't happened in this case, you know, yeah, so how does that reflect in through the literature, or actually the study of structural violence, or maybe even what did Cross think? I mean, was he part of a sort of, you know, a revolution that didn't materialize? Has he ever reflected on this sort of, you know, linear, non-materializing facet of the movement and the life that he could have given for it?
I'll quickly, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think Cross mentions that the kidnappers recognized that they themselves were not going to see sort of a revolution, but they, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, and I mean, this goes back to the anarchists in the 19th century, this idea of propaganda by the deed, that it's not enough to proselytize, you need to sort of take action, and by taking action, you inspire others to do so as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons he said, you know, they probably would have been happy to have been martyrs, but you know, in the end, it's also a small number of individuals who are involved in this. And there's, again, as you reference, you know, the idea of a vanguard that are willing to do this. And I mean, I think they looked as well at inspiration of what went on in Algeria and Fanon, and the idea of you needing to use violence to free yourself of colonialism, that it's not simply enough to achieve independence peacefully, because with the colonialism, there's emasculation, and the only way to, in a sense, overturn that is through violence. So that this was kind of the preferred course. But again, I mean, I think they're hoping this is a spark. This is the beginning of something bigger. And in a sense, it's the beginning of, obviously, you know, the mainstream independence movement, as I think was mentioned earlier, you know, sort of comes to the fore in the 1970s, and the FLQ disappears.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you to all of our panelists. What a fascinating talk, what a fascinating discussion. Thanks for everyone's participation in the audience as well. I'm going to call our quick break at this time. We're going to come back here at 1 p.m. Eastern time, that is 6 p.m. British time, for session 4. We're going to have a panel on public policy and constitutional questions. We'll see you then. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And thanks for joining us for this 4th and final session of the BACS conference. So to begin session 4, I'm going to call upon the panel's chair, James Kennedy.
Hi, folks. Welcome back. Hello, Karlo. Hello, Daniel. Okay, so for this final panel, we have convened our very own B&B Commission, that's Béland and Basta, to discuss current developments in public policy and constitutional politics in Canada, and perhaps even in the UK, or to at least draw out some comparisons. There's a lot going on, so we thought this might be a good time to begin to take stock. Let me just introduce our 2 panelists. We have, very, very grateful to both of them for being here. We have Daniel Béland, who is James McGill Professor of Political Science and Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. Daniel's interests range across political sociology and territorial politics, but with a particular focus on public policy. His most recent book is How Ideas and Institutions Shape the Politics of Public Policy, and that's published in Cambridge. Carlo Basta, my colleague at Edinburgh, is lecturer in politics and international relations. He's co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change, and very importantly, he's member of the Centre of Canadian Studies. Carlo's research engages with the institutional makeup of multinational states, so Canada, UK, and so on. His most recent book is The Symbolic State, minority recognition, majority backlash, and secession in multinational countries. And that's coming out later this year on McGill Queen, so there's still time to pre-order. Our aim here is not necessarily to come to any conclusions, but to start a conversation that we hope that you will be a part of. So we're very keen for your thoughts, your questions, your participation. So I'm just going to hand over now to Daniel and Karlo to kick off this conversation. I don't remember what we decided. Who's going first?
I think we decided first. There we go. There you go. I've been volunteered.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karlo.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks also for asking me to participate here. It is a pleasure, and I want to thank to all organizing institutions. The BMB commission, by the way, Jimmy, that was a nice touch. Thank you very much. All right, so I mean, without much by way of an intro, I just want to kind of get into it. I don't want to take more than 15 minutes of your time. The presentation is going to be about this kind of nexus between constitutional change and secession, which is the kind of work that I normally do. I will try to quite explicitly draw some parallels between the Canadian context, specifically with reference to Quebec, and what is happening currently in the United Kingdom. So I am a recent arrival to the UK. I was an associate professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland until December of 2019. So I arrived here quite recently, and you know, a couple of months later, the pandemic hit and all that. But it's been a really remarkable year for somebody with my interests here in the UK. It is hardly a day goes by, really, without somebody in the press or on a public platform mentioning either the possibility of the breakup of the United Kingdom, or even in some cases, you know, coming to the conclusion that it's a foregone conclusion, in a sense, right? That it's almost a matter of time when Scotland will leave and Northern Ireland follow behind. More rare are suggestions that constitutional change is afoot, but that's definitely there in the, I would say, more in the political world. And I mean, you know, the reasons for that are quite, I think, obvious. The revisiting of the Scotland issue with the potential for a second referendum, the catalyst that Brexit was, both for what's happening in Scotland, but also what's happening in Northern Ireland, but also the issue of self-determination in Wales, where constitutional reform is also kind of has gone from the back to the front burner, but also an increase in support for independence in that jurisdiction. And then finally, also a much more concerted effort to understand the English dimension of British multinationality. So I don't, you know, this is what's on my desk currently. How Britain ends, the Northern question, of course, with reference to Northern England. One here also kind of rethinking Englishness, and then finally, my colleague Elsa Henderson and Richard Winch-Jones's Englishness, right? So, you know, this is just kind of a sample of the kinds of things that are out there in the public sphere. So, you know, I'm here for the last year, seeing all of this, and because I'm a comparativist, my mind quite naturally goes to other contexts. And one of those, of course, is Canada, not only because I lived there for about 25 years, but also because I've studied it and included it in my work. And so, to me, it's a kind of natural thing to try to contemplate the constitutional question in the United Kingdom by reference to other cases or other contexts like Canada, but also Spain and beyond. But there's a kind of tension there as well. I feel that in the UK, too much of the commentary about the constitutional question is a little bit too parochial without reference to those other cases. But then when such comparisons are drawn, I'm equally frustrated. Because I feel that far too often it's kind of facile comparison, kind of throwaway comparison with other cases without much thought going into that. I myself can't help but draw these comparisons, and I'm frustrated by my own efforts at that. So what I'll do today for the next, I guess, 10 to 12 minutes is to try to, in a sense, run a comparison between UK and Canada, but in the hope that I'm not going to be doing too much violence to the specificities, to the idiosyncrasies of each context. So I'll start with what I believe are similarities. So when Jimmy asked me to do this presentation, I was trying to figure out what the best way would be to frame it, and I came up with a question that to me was kind of a curious one, an interesting one, which is, what's the equivalent of the current constitutional moment in the UK in recent Canadian history, right? And I would like to submit to you that that a parallel can be drawn to our current moment in the UK to about 1982 to 1984 in Canada. It's an imperfect comparison, but I hope it'll make sense over the next couple of minutes. So this is where I think the parallels are. So, 1970s see this kind of a rise of sovereigntist movement in Quebec. Parti Québécois gets founded in the late 1960s. It ends up competing in provincial elections, and ultimately it wins in 1976. Wins a majority government. But what's interesting to note, and I think this is the parallel with Scotland, is that the 1976 victory of the Parti Québécois was not a victory of a sovereignist party that's riding the wave of popular support for secession. In fact, one can argue that it was because the Parti Québécois kind of moderated its sovereigntist message, as well as its kind of class struggle message, as well as the unpopularity of the incumbent Liberal Party of Quebec that produced that 1976 result. And yet, of course, Parti Québécois' raison d'être is sovereignty. And so in part as a consequence of that, the PQ government did eventually hold a referendum on sovereignty association in 1980. And the result there was a significant minority of people voting in favor of sovereignty association, so 40%, and then 60% of those who voted against. So that's the first kind of process. There's a parallel, and I would say somewhat related process that's happening, which was the issue of constitutional patriation. And of course, this was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's baby, and certainly it was a kind of project that was of interest to political elites across Canada, but I would say that it was probably more kind of popular and more important in the rest of Canada outside of Quebec, even though of course it wasn't irrelevant in Quebec either. So what happens in 1981, the patriation, the constitutional patriation occurs, takes place, but of course without Quebec's approval. And so what we have is a very interesting kind of political context where the sovereignty movement on one hand has been discouraged by the result of the 1980 referendum, but at the same time, people have been riled and rattled by the manner in which the Constitution had been patriated. And so this context is then seized upon by the official opposition, federal opposition at the time, which are the Progressive Conservatives of Brian Mulroney, who are seeking to get back to power through addressing these grievances in Quebec. And ultimately, of course, they managed to do that. They are elected in 1984. And this leads, I mean, it's not the only factor, but ultimately it leads to major attempts at major constitutional reform at Meech Lake and then Charlottetown. So where are the parallels? Well, I mean, if you look at the 2011 Scottish election, which was the door that opened the path to the 2014 referendum, there are quite a few similarities to what happened in 1976 Quebec. So SNP does win a majority in 2011. Of course, it was in power for 4 years prior to that, but it does not win it on a kind of wave of support for independence. Quite the contrary. I mean, in the first mandate of the SNP government, they were trying to build their reputation as a competent party of government. So in large part, it's this that brings them to power in 2011. The issue of a referendum is not kind of foregrounded in that campaign, but of course, just as with Parti Québécois, it's part of SNP's DNA, and of course, the SNP ultimately does end up holding the referendum in 2014, and the result again is fairly similar to what we see in 1980 referendum in Quebec, 45% of those voting in favor of independence and 55% against. So here we have that one track, which is the independence track, and that kind of intersects 2 years later with Brexit, right? So here also we have a kind of similarity wherein, relatively speaking, unrelated event, in some sense similar to patriation, intersects with the issue of independence. So just as with patriation, a Brexit is in effect a major constitutional change. It's very different, obviously, but it's nevertheless quite far-reaching constitutional change that is happening without the approval of either the Scottish elites or the Scottish population, if we look at the results of the Brexit vote in Scotland itself. And of course, until the present day, all the way until now, Nicola Sturgeon keeps insisting that Brexit is happening against the wishes of the Scottish people, and this keeps being repeated during debates and legislation around a repatriation of powers from the European Union back to the UK. The key difference here, of course, which I don't need to remind anybody here, is that we have a pandemic, and that pandemic helps push the support for independence across the 50% threshold, where it's remained for the past year or so. So a third parallel is, and again, I'm drawing them because I have this kind of urge to do so, but I don't want to go too far, and I'm going to get to the dissimilarities in a second. The third parallel is that this is the kind of situation that has created a kind of demand for constitutional change of some sort, whether that change takes the form of secession of one part of the United Kingdom or constitutional reform is an open question, obviously, but it creates a kind of political opportunity for the official opposition, which in the United Kingdom is the UK Labour Party. So again, what we have here is an attempt by Labour to effectively get back into power into government, essentially through Scotland, notably through the launch of the Constitutional Commission that is supposed to be headed by Gordon Brown, and that would seek, as Starmer noted, to push as much power away from the center as possible. But again, this is the similar kind of political calculus that the progressive conservatives in 1984 had as they were appealing to Quebecers. But here I think the similarities actually end. So I want to note three kind of points that make the two situations quite dissimilar, although there are some structural similarities as well. So the first one is that I think any reform, any constitutional reform that seeks to address the problems, and this is assuming there is going to be one, which I think is a huge assumption, that seeks to address the problems stemming from Brexit in Scotland, but also in other devolved jurisdictions, will need to figure out how better to include those jurisdictions at the center, right? In Westminster, but also in Whitehall. And here, I think there is a dissimilarity, because despite the fact that some of this was there in Charlottetown Accord with Triple E Senate, it wasn't the kind of centerpiece of the entire reform, especially not for Meech Lake. The second issue, and that's a critical difference between the UK and Canada, is that in the context of the UK, there is the question of what to do with England. And this is really so here the difference really is that in Canada in the 1980s, the constitutional reform, the question there was, what kind of federalism do we want? Whereas here, the question would actually be, do we want federalism at all? Or what kind of constitutional framework do we want to begin with? So, you know, Canada in 1980 was obviously for a century a federalized country. And so however far-reaching the reforms in Meech Lake and Charlottetown were, they were more feasible, I would say, politically than, or less daunting than what is facing the UK government or any future UK government. And again, I think the key reason for that is the status of England. Of course, the options here are, let's say, an English parliament, and this might better foster the sense that UK is a partnership of 4 equal nations. But of course, the problem with this is, as everybody keeps saying, that whatever system would emerge from this would have 4 units with one, you know, containing 85% of the population, so completely lopsided. The second option would be some sort of regionalization of England, 5, 6, 7 units. But of course, this is not particularly popular. And the only time something like this was attempted in northeast of England, it was soundly defeated in a referendum. Or there could be the kind of most, well, the least far-reaching reform, some sort of, taking what is already there, like the combined authorities, and then extending that across the territory of England. The third difference between the two contexts, to my mind, is the most important one. It strikes me that there's a fundamental difference in the way in which UK's political elites, and by that I mean primarily those that are based in London and home counties, but also a good part of the English population, the way in which they view the possibility of their union's breakup. And I think they're far less perturbed by that prospect than their counterparts were in Canada during the 1980s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whenever. I'm still not completely clear on why this is the case. My pet hypothesis is that the idea of the state in the UK is so fundamentally different from what you can find in most places on the European continent. And in that sense, I would argue that Canadian elites are actually far more European than their UK counterparts. But the upshot is that I think it's even if there is enough kind of political will inside of the UK Labour Party to engage in this kind of reform, massive constitutional reform, I wonder how much appetite there is going to be beyond Labour. And frankly, I would bet that if faced with the magnitude of the task, the political, the administrative, the legal magnitude of the task of such reform, many members of the UK governing elite would rather entertain Scottish independence than far-reaching constitutional reform in the federal direction. But again, time will show. And on that note, I think this was about 15 minutes, so I hope this does it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karlo. Oh,
I was not sure who should go. Yes, you can.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead. It's, yeah.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Karlo. These are really very useful remarks. And as someone who has done some work comparing Canada and the UK, especially Quebec and Scotland, what you said rings true, although I have some questions that I hope we can discuss later. But thank you very much for the invitation, Jimmy and the rest of the organizing team. I'm really glad to be here with you today, with our beautiful campus in the background. Probably better to see that than our cat and the mess behind me. But this is today an opportunity to think about, I think, historical ties or parallels between the UK and Canada. And later, I will actually speak a bit about Quebec and Scotland. But I will start with a more general comparison about social policy. Especially health policy in Canada and in the UK. And I want to center the discussion about the concept of universal social programs or universality. You know, when Canadians think about social policy, especially healthcare, they always like to compare themselves with the US. And we saw that actually during even the pandemic. When things were not going well at all in the US last year, people were, people in Canada were, I think many of them will state publicly that they were quite happy to be in Canada rather than the US. Right now, things have changed because of the vaccination process, and now there is some envy, US envy on the part of some Canadians who would like the vaccination process to be as fast in our country as it is in the US or in the UK for that matter. But certainly there is quite a bit of research that reflects this, I think, Canadian obsession for the US. You see that when we talk about healthcare reform, there are several books that compare the historical development of health coverage, healthcare in Canada and the United States by Antonia Maioni, by Jerry Boychuk, for example, which are widely debated in the literature. But what I want to say today is that if you're interested in universal social programs, not targeted social programs or programs where entitlement is based on necessarily on contributions, but when you talk about programs where entitlement is based on residency and citizenship, as is the case with the NHS in the UK and Medicare in Canada, then looking at the United States makes little sense, because the United States doesn't have universal social programs in the strong sense of the term. It never had. And that's not just in healthcare, beyond that as well, in family policy, pensions, and so forth. The United States is really, in terms of social policy, is grounded in this opposition between social assistance for the poor and social insurance for people who have contributed to Medicare and Social Security, which are two large federal social insurance programs. But as I've shown in an article I published some years ago with Alex Wadden, there are no universal social programs in the US, that is, programs where entitlement is based on residency and or citizenship. And that is related to another important reality, that in the US, there is no strong sense of social citizenship. Social citizenship, which is a British concept that we associate with the Attlee reforms of the post-war era and with the work of T.H. Marshall, a British sociologist who wrote a famous essay in 1950 about citizenship and social class. And in Canada, both in Canada and the UK, social citizenship is a major issue in terms of academic debates. And this discussion about the link between citizenship and social policy is something that extends beyond the ivory tower, beyond academic debates. So I think universality and universal social program is an interesting way to actually compare Canada and the UK, and to also study British influence on Canada. And this is something that was quite well known decades ago, but over the last 30 or 40 years, as I said, maybe 50 years, Canadians have really looked south in order to define themselves, their own identity. In healthcare, the fact that Canada has universal healthcare for all citizens and permanent resident based on the province or territory where they live. So it's a decentralized system, but it's universal. Universality is guaranteed by the 1984 Canada Health Act. There's a sense that Canadians have built their national identity in opposition to the US, and healthcare, universal coverage has been part of the ways in which Canadians have defined themselves in contrast to the US. But historically, universality, which we celebrate in Canada in terms of healthcare, is actually something that emerged in other countries, and especially in the UK. So right now I'm working with Greg Marchildon and a few other scholars on the influence of the 1942 Beveridge report. And this 1942 Beveridge report has been very influential all over the world, including in Canada. And it has helped spread the idea of universal coverage in social policy. And what we do in the paper that I'm writing with Greg Marchildon and a few other colleagues is studying the influence of the Beveridge report, and I would say more generally British social policy ideas on the development of universal healthcare in Saskatchewan, in the province of Saskatchewan, just after the Second World War, about at the same time as the NHS was created in the UK. And then look at how this idea of universal healthcare had an influence on healthcare in Canada more generally. So I think there is an interesting angle here. And it's clear that the Beveridge report, the Attlee reforms, the creation of the NHS, these are things that Canadian academics, experts, even at the time journalists, debated and discussed. And this is something that Canadians forget today, but it's important to remind them about that. So there is a British tradition of universal social policy that exists in Canada. Of course, it was transformed. It's in the context of federalism. so it has a different meaning than in the UK. But Canada has developed universal social programs. In addition to Medicare, there is, of course, old age security, this universal pension created, federal pension created in the early 1950s. And again, here, the UK was a model, at least implicitly. So very strong ties, I think, in terms of what we call policy transfer, or the transfer of policy ideas from a country to the next between Canada and the UK during the 1940s and 50s. This is less the case today, but it was very strong at the time. Again, universality, universal social programs is an interesting lens to look at Canada and the UK. Now, I want to move to the subnational level and really engage with the issue that Karlo discussed in his presentation, which is sub-state nationalism. And it's, in my case, I will focus on not on constitutional issues, but on social policy. And as you may know, I've published with André Lecourt a book back in 2008 about nationalism and social policy, the politics of territorial solidarity, that was published with the UK office of Oxford University Press. And in that book, we compare Quebec within Canada, Scotland within the UK, and Flanders within Belgium. And in that book, we showed that universal social programs are particularly helpful for subnational governments that want to differentiate themselves, that want to create a distinct identity in comparison to the other regions of the country or the central government. And we showed that this actually, this strategy to adopt universal social programs at the subnational level by nationalist parties became a significant trend both in Quebec and Scotland in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So in Scotland, right after devolution. In Quebec, it was under the Parti Québécois government after the defeat of the 1995 referendum. And so in this context, both in Scotland and in Quebec, we can say that universal social policy became closely intertwined with sub-state nationalism. In Quebec, it took the form of subsidized childcare. At first was childcare at $5 per person, but it was really perceived as a universal program. We can also talk about parental benefits. Okay, so Quebec developed distinct family policies at the time, and both universality and social citizenship were closely related to these initiatives. So they were part of a nation-building project, distinguishing yourself from the rest of the country, from the federal government, by developing unique policies that are grounded in citizenship, or at least in residency, and where you can build this sense of national solidarity at the subnational level. In Scotland, something similar happened after devolution, when we talk about free universal personal long-term care for older people, or even we could extend that logic to even university tuition, for example. So the idea here is that universal social programs, through this idea of social citizenship, can help build a sense of territorial solidarity. It can be at the federal or central state level. And we saw that in Canada with old age security, for example, or family allowances in the 1940s and 50s. So state building and even nation building on the part of the central government, the central state. But you can also see that, of course, and I would say it's the same thing with the NHS in the UK in the 1940s. But you can also, of course, look at the role of universal social policies at the subnational level, and how they can help nationalist movements and parties send a message to residents of their province or region or country, regardless of how you call it, that they are all in this together, and they are part of this imagined community. If you go back to Benedict Anderson, what we showed in our work with André Lecourt on nationalism and social policy, and there are other people who have worked on that, like Nicola McEwen, who's based in Edinburgh, is a colleague of Karlo. I'm not sure if they're in the same department, but they are the same institution, wonderful university. I think it's important to understand the link between the nation as an imagined community at the state or the sub-state level and social policy. And so the link between nationalism and social policy is important. And the argument that we are making with André Lecourt is that this claim about the relationship between nation building and social policy is especially strong when the programs are based on residency and or citizenship, which is when they are about really territorial solidarity and shared citizenship. So this is just in a nutshell. I don't want to talk for too long. I think we want to have time for discussion. But I want to use this discussion to really emphasize the fact that there are a lot of things that Canadians can learn by looking at the historical development of universal social programs in the UK, and look at also contemporary debates in the UK about social policy. So instead of always, I mean, comparing Canada and the US makes sense when we talk about federalism, for example. In some policy areas, it's really I think it's really useful. But when we talk about policy design, especially when we focus on universality, we don't have much to learn from the US because they don't have universal programs. But the UK is one of the countries where these universal programs emerge, with also social democratic countries. So when a few years ago we edited this book on universal social policy with Greg Marchildon and Michael Prince at the University of Toronto Press, it's called Universality and Social Policy in Canada. I just put the URL in the chat. When we were actually looking for comparative chapters and look at other countries to compare with Canada, we didn't include a chapter on the US because there's nothing to compare really in that sense, unless you just want to explain why the US doesn't have universal social programs. But we actually had one chapter on the UK and one on Sweden. So it's quite interesting. Of course, the UK and Canada, unlike Sweden, are considered to be liberal welfare state regimes, not social democratic regimes. So they are, in that case, they share quite a bit with the US, which is also considered to be a liberal welfare regime. But then when you look at universal social programs, the UK and the US and Canada are quite different animals. And here, the UK and Canada have a lot in common, and they are standing strong contrast with the US. So I think what I'm saying to my Canadian friends here is that, looking always at the US and comparing yourself to the US on a regular basis is fine as long as you look at other countries. And when we talk about social policy, especially universal social policy, I will argue that we have to look at what's happening in Nordic countries, but also in the UK, especially because of the historical ties, post-colonial ties between the UK and Canada, the influence of the Beveridge Report, which was widely read and cited here in Canada. And I think the strength of this idea of universality, which is something that we share and that is still contested, widely debated in both countries today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was great. I think that you brought up some great points there, especially when mentioning comparing Canada's social programs to some of those in Europe and the Scandinavian countries. That's such a great point. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor up to questions, comments. I don't see anything coming in immediately. James, would you like to?
So one thing I probably should have said at the start is that there is another consequence of Brexit, and that is that both the UK and the Canadian governments are very keen to forge closer links. And so this comparison is very relevant to precisely the backdrop of actual geopolitics taking place at the present time. There is an ongoing conversation between the UK government and the Canadian government under Johnson and under Trudeau. They're very keen to forge closer relationships. So perhaps, you know, it may be, I don't know, Daniel, whether Canadians will start looking over the Atlantic again rather than looking down south. So, I mean, there is that sort of Brexit context. I mean, I know this from the High Commission in the UK, the Canadian High Commission here in the UK, just about the degree to which this has become an issue. I wonder, I mean, I see the link immediately between what I thought were two great presentations, Karlo making mention of the sort of the degrees to which there's difference. And I like in particular the time periods that Karlo had selected. You know, that was very nicely done. You know, I hadn't really quite thought of it in those terms, but there's a paper there. That is just a terrific kind of comparison of those two time periods. The one thing though is that you made mention of the potential solution or the potential way in which the UK might develop on a more federal model and the degree to which that's problematic with the incorporation of England. I take that entirely, as you said, 85% of the population. And yet, one thing that comes out very clearly from the pandemic is that the UK is now almost being conceived of in almost like kind of quasi-federal terms. You think of the news coverage of the responses to the pandemic, it has a very federal feel. Even the BBC, the great British Broadcasting Corporation, is now very careful in distinguishing between England's response to the pandemic, Scotland's response, Wales's response, you know, led not by a nationalist government at all, but by a Labour government in Wales, and the response in the north of Ireland. You know, so there's a very clear sense that the UK is not entirely the same. And it points, in fact, to something that Daniel was making the point, particularly in relation to health. You know, you would have thought, you know, everyone can understand that health is devolved in the UK, or it's a provincial matter in Canada, because it's kind of that daily thing that's not really important. It's not the big stuff. It's not foreign policy. It's not defense. And yet during a pandemic, it's incredibly important. It's the biggest issue. And everyone starts to focus. And yet it's within, particularly in the UK, it's a devolved matter, or retained by England for it. So there's something about that feeds there into that relationship that Daniel was talking about in relation to the way in which social citizenship is also linked to national identification, and the way in which the two become entwined, not simply just Canadian or British, but Scottish or Quebecois, Welsh, or Saskatchewan. I mean, because we have to mention Tommy Douglas as the great Scottish Canadian reformer. So I just, you know, that was just a, you know, as a Scot, I have to make mention of Tommy Douglas, the great Scottish Canadian in Saskatchewan. I don't know if do you guys want to come back in on anything there in relation to those remarks?
Do you want to start, Karlo, or you want me to answer first?
Daniel, go right ahead.
Thank you. You're right about the media coverage in the UK. I've noticed that, but in Canada, of course, healthcare has been, you know, provincial. I mean, we have 13 different healthcare systems in this country. Each system is universal for the residents of the province or the territory. And it's portable, right? When you move to a new province, you get a new health card from the province, but it's highly portable. Now, during the pandemic, you see in Canada how, although people like, again, to compare the performance of Canada to the performance of other countries, especially the US. So when things were not going too bad in the US, people can say, well, it's not so great here, but at least we don't have Trump as a president. And, you know, things are not so bad in terms of the pandemic and the number of cases per capita and so forth. But of course, now it's a different story because they get vaccinated much faster than we do and so forth. So there is an emphasis on Canada as a whole, but in these international comparisons, but in reality, the pandemic has hit in a highly, you know, regional way, in the sense that there are huge discrepancies in terms of, if you look at each wave, especially, it's some provinces have has been hit really hard during the first wave, like Quebec. And now it's actually the third wave. It's now Ontario that's hit, that's being hit so much. Atlantic provinces not so much, but there is a very strong sense in Canada of the provinces being responsible for healthcare and for public health. And now there are people in Canada who call for, and they have been calling for the Emergencies Act and the federal government to increase its role in public health during the pandemic. I'm not sure this will actually work, but Justin Trudeau is very, very careful. And he basically said last spring, I will only do it if the provinces ask me to do it, right? And that's interesting because we had the panel on the October crisis before this one, where the War War Act was adopted, and the Emergencies Act that we have today replaced the War Measures Act in the mid-1980s. But so when you look at the pandemic, it's really provincial identities and how they relate to the federal government actually play a major role in the politics of this. And now you see a lot of Ontarians are really mad at Doug Ford, conservative government at the provincial level, and they want Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Prime Minister, to step in, but he can only offer help. If he will try to impose it, that could have really dire consequences. And that will be even more the case if he was dealing with Quebec or Alberta, which Alberta is not doing very well right now. So if you try to impose the Emergencies Act upon Alberta or Quebec, that in Quebec, people have bad souvenirs from 1970, but in Alberta, there is strong quest for provincial autonomy. So it's a very difficult situation, and it's public health here is about national identity in a way, and regional provincial identities, which is, I think, quite interesting. Karlo?
Thank you. All fantastic points. So to go back to Jimmy's starting point, I think you're basically framing it as a kind of a federalization of a discourse in a sense, right? And so I haven't systematically been following it over the past half a year, but I'm working on a paper with Elsa Henderson, who's my colleague in the department, and we've been basically looking at the way in which that discourse has been emanating from 10 Downing since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, we only looked at the first 2 to 3 months, but during those first 2 to 3 months, it was actually remarkably confusing, and there was a lot of elision of, and I think Elsa said, what does this country mean? Because there was a lot of in this country, but it wasn't clear at all whether in this country meant in England or in the United Kingdom. Right, so that was the starting point. So I think probably the BBC and a bunch of other institutions have become more careful. But there's been a lot of effort, by the way, by various bodies, including a couple of sort of Twitter-only organizations, including That's Devolved, et cetera, right, to kind of point to the fact that, hang on a second, I mean, this is something that we need to be a lot clearer about in order to communicate whether or not something applies to the entire United Kingdom or to devolved jurisdictions or to England and Wales only, et cetera, right? And of course, all of that is complicated precisely by the fact that it's not a federal system in which, and however complex and complicated Canada is, it is nevertheless far clearer in terms of jurisdictional division than what we actually have in the UK, precisely because of this remarkable institutional asymmetry in what is, in effect, a federacy, or it would be a federacy if there were kind of constitutional guarantees that Scottish or Northern Irish or the Welsh jurisdiction was, it could only be changed with their approval. So yeah.
Thank you, Karlo, and thank you, Daniel. We have several questions here from the audience, so let's move along to those. The first one goes to Patrick Holdich.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, when I put my hand up earlier, I didn't realize sort of the number of questions. I can see a number of landmines I could walk onto very quickly and blow myself up. So I'll stick to 3 and try not to end my career too quickly. In terms of comparisons between UK and Canada, yeah, you're right. Of course, there's a lot going on. I mean, my only advice to people is be very careful not to make selective comparisons. It's terribly easy to look at a city and say, well, look at that. That means we must do that. And I keep saying, Well, actually, you know, if I keep telling people it's not as simple as that, they're probably going to throttle me. But I think it's really important to continually reinforce context, 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 which you guys are doing really well, I must say. The second point, Karlo, constitutional debate. You know, when you said, you know, we're somewhere in 1982, 84, you know, I like that, because I thought we were somewhere about 1992 to 94. So, you know, we're fine. We'll take the 1980s. So I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here, but, you know, there's a lot going on. But let me put you on the spot, Karlo. I mean, constitutional debate, you know, I entered, you know, studying Canadian politics in the mid-80s, you know, straight into the Meech Lake and all that. And the history goes, you know, from at least, well, if you don't go back to 1867, you lead 1971, the Victoria Conference, and it goes on for pretty well 30 years. I mean, did it end up strengthening Canada, or did it end up weakening the country? Because, you know, you can say, what did it actually achieve after all that time? And that's something which may have echoes here. And just the third point on Danielle, I mean, fantastic, you know, and I have read a little bit of your stuff, but not enough, I have to admit. But one thing about social policy is that it doesn't actually help the Union of Canada, because certainly in Quebec, although Quebec's very late getting to, l'assurance maladie is only adopted in 1969, it's actually quite late, but the Parti Québécois really captures the whole frame of the state it's the provinces there to the Quebec model, which develops this very strong role of the state, high taxes, high services, and that's really a sort of a nationalist focus, which really removes the federal government from the argument. So we, as you know, with Meech Lake, one of the arguments is whether the federal government should be allowed or restricted from being involved in funding programs. And it always seems a bit of a debate, you know, why not, you know, surely any money is good money, but it becomes a sort of political issue. So I wonder if the social union actually has ended up being co-opted as a sort of Quebec sort of nationalist strength, rather than some helping it sort of be part of Canada. Thanks.
Great questions. If you don't mind, Daniel, I'll just take it first. So I absolutely take and this is where I frustrate myself every now and again, because I kind of rush to judgment, perhaps. But I think, so there's useful analytical kind of mileage to be gotten out of comparisons, but I think we should be thrice as careful about any kind of prescriptive lessons that we might derive from that. So you're absolutely right. In terms of whether or not the constitutional attempts at constitutional reform of the 1980s and early 1990s actually ended up strengthening Canada, I mean, I think there is no doubt that, at least in my mind, that ultimately they resulted in the kind of backlash in the early 1990s in Quebec that was definitely not there in 1970s, right? But I think, and that's something that the forthcoming book that Jimmy was referencing, that's what I kind of cover in there. And I think the reason for that is that, first of all, the content of the reforms themselves, the way in which they were interpreted in the rest of Canada, and specifically that distinct society clause and what that meant in the rest of Canada, right? So I would argue that the issue there, and then of course the third was, if you're going to have this kind of major reform, you better make sure that you have all the main parties on board on the majority side. Because, you know, it's one thing if a minority nation demands X, Y, or Z and you don't accommodate that. But I think it's more politically combustible to actually end up promising something and then taking it back. And I think that's precisely what actually happened with Meech Lake and particularly with Meech Lake, really, right, rather than Charlottetown. So I would argue that the fact that distinct society implied a kind of symbolic reconstitution of Canada, or at least that's how it was interpreted in the rest of Canada outside of Quebec, away from, yes, certainly diverse state, linguistically, regionally, et cetera, but nevertheless a nation state of a single political people, the Canadians, right? That would get transformed into a binational state of two political peoples, right? The Quebecois and then the rest of Canadians. And of course, there's all kinds of other elements to the whole story, you know, the First Nation resistance to the way in which things were playing out, the women's organizations, you know, the decline of difference, all of that kind of stuff. But I think the key element there, and I think the polls of the time actually would in effect support this contention, is that that a very substantial proportion of Canadians outside of Quebec basically said, well, no, this is not, we don't want that, right? And this was something that on the back of which first Meech Lake and then Charlottetown were defeated. And I think it's this offering and then taking back, demonstrating basically to Quebec that you know, the rest of Canada actually does not want to reconstitute itself and recognize itself as a multinational state. I think that was the key issue there. And I think that actually weakened Canada at that particular point. I think what's really telling is that in 1991, as Meech Lake is failing, support for sovereignty association hits something like 65% in the polls. Right? I mean, this never happened up until that point. And support for outright independence, which was only about 20% in 1980, right? According to the polls, hit close to 50%, right? So it's a completely different kind of political situation. And I think in that sense, it was in a way a mistake by Mulroney, who basically thought, oh, we're going to do this relatively easily. I think that's a lesson I think that ought to be heeded in the UK. If there's going to be major constitutional reform in the UK, you better make sure that it's conducted in such a way that you have buy-in by all the major political parties in England, so that they wouldn't try to make political points off of opposing it. And so I think the irony there is that it's far more likely that such reform is going to be carried out by Labour, UK Labour, but in those circumstances, it would be the Conservatives who would be far more likely to try to make political points off of that. So I think that's actually very dangerous.
Yes, I can add about this. First of all, if I talk about the constitutional aspect of it, it's true. You're absolutely right, Karlo. What happened in 1995, what I think 1987 and 1995, so the Lake Meech Accord, and especially its rejection, the fact that it was never adopted, actually, and the referendum, they would not have had a referendum in 1995 without the defeat of Lake Meech. It's quite clear. And the idea that Canada rejected us was really a central aspect of this rhetoric leading to the referendum. So you're absolutely right. Mulroney thought he was really clever. So Lake Meech, he invited all the premiers into one room, and after, I think, one day or not long, they just came out and, they announced the agreement. There was no public consultation. Many people were stunned and surprised. That was really what we call executive federalism, right? Just the premiers and the prime minister, you sit in a room, and then among the elite, you devise something and you say, this is what the new constitutional order in Canada will be. And then you try to have then the legislatures enact that all across the country. And that's where there was a lack of consultation. Now for Charlottetown, they tried the other way around with a referendum, because they were criticized for not being open enough and democratic enough, but that also backfired. So it didn't work. So that's quite fascinating. Regarding social policy and the federal government, I think the question that Patrick's question about the federal government is interesting. As we show in our work with André Lecourt, the federal government did use social policy as a form of nation building at the federal level through family allowances implemented in 1945, which was a universal program, and also old age security implemented in 1951, which adopted in the early 50s, which is also universal. And during the referendum campaign in 1980, we found quotes of federalist politicians who said, if you secede, if you separate, you will lose your old age security pension. So you have some federal social policies, especially in terms of cash transfers, in terms of family benefits and pensions that do matter for ordinary citizens, including people in Quebec, and that's important. Something that Maurice Duplessis understood in the mid 1940s. because he very strongly criticized the federal family allowance program, which was a universal program. He criticized it because larger families, Catholic families mostly, would be penalized by the way the program was designed, but also because he saw it as a way for the federal government to increase its role in the lives of ordinary citizens, which in the end could be a threat to provincial autonomy. Moving back, so I think there is, some universal federal social programs, and that it's a way for the feds to get involved in the lives of ordinary people by sending them checks. We saw that during the pandemic with CRB, huge program, an emergency program, sending more than $80 billion to Canadians from coast to coast to coast, including millions of Quebecers. So the federal government does also use social policy as a form of a nation or country building, if you prefer. There's also the financial aspect of it, the equalization program created in 1957, which is about sending money to provinces that are below the average fiscal capacity. Quebec has received money from that program nonstop since 1957, since the creation of this program. And I've written about this, and there's a book that just came out recently by Mary Janigan called The Art of Sharing, and she shows very careful historical analysis, archival research, that equalization was designed to, in a way, extend territorial solidarity to Quebec after they left the tax rentals agreement enacted during the Second World War, and it was redesigned to in the name of national unity, in a way, with Quebec in mind, which is interesting. You would think it was for Atlantic Canada, because they are poor provinces. Today, that's the way we look at equalization, and we focus on Quebec, but also Atlantic Canada, even Manitoba. But at the time, Quebec was front stage, and that's important to keep that in mind. So that's also a tool for national unity on the part of the federal government, using its fiscal power, and especially giving money to a province like Quebec. And then people in Alberta criticize that, right? And people like Tom Flanagan and many others in Alberta come out, and even today they say, equalization is a way to buy out votes in Quebec or in some other provinces, and it's unfair towards Alberta. So I will stop here, but I think that the federal government does play a role in terms of nation building, or at least they try. And during the pandemic, it worked quite well because it reinforced I would say, the presence of the federal government in everyday lives. Because what the feds don't do is that they don't deliver services for the most part. It's mainly the provinces that deliver healthcare services, education services. We don't have a federal Department of Education. So yes, the provinces are more present in the everyday lives of citizens because of education and healthcare, because of services. But Ottawa, with the checks that they send, the checks that they send to people and also to provinces through equalization, the Canada Health Transfer, the Canada Social Transfer, they also project this idea that we are all in this together as a country, and the federal government is building the country through social programs and also fiscal federalism.
Thank you, Daniel. Excuse me. The next question is from Giuseppe Amatuli.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a fascinating talk, and I just wish we could be together in person somewhere. I would like to ask a question to Karlo, just because. Just one, because otherwise we are not going to end. So, and it's a bit different, Karlo, but you were mentioning, 1982 and the repatriation, and because of my background, because of the fact that I've been working with a First Nation in Canada, in British Columbia, actually. British Columbia is the first Canadian province that is implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People within the legal framework, right? And so I was just wondering, do you think that there will be, any change, or, something can happen from a constitutional point of view when it comes to, to the implementation of the UN Declaration within the legal framework, given that each province maybe implementing the declaration differently. And, Daniel was mentioning Alberta, and I'm not quite sure that Alberta will ever implement the declaration for a bunch of reasons. But, in British Columbia, the situation is quite interesting and also fascinating. And I was just wondering if you think that, at some point there will be provinces that really want to implement the declaration, provinces that are not interested in implementing the declaration, and how this will affect eventually from a federal point of view, the legislation.
Well, frankly, I think actually, Daniel, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you'd be far better placed to answer this question than I would. Unfortunately, okay. Giuseppe, I actually cannot really speak to it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you're right, it's a complex issue because of federalism, and the provinces are not all on the same page about this. It depends what government is in power. If you have, for example, I think British Columbia, if you want to use this metaphor, is way ahead of, say, Saskatchewan, for example. It's just, it's the political culture. I think there is less will on the part of some provincial governments to really move fast or to prioritize this issue. And especially the case, if you look at Saskatchewan, where I lived for many years, the Sask party receives very little support from Indigenous peoples on average in terms of the electorate. So you have to look at the electorate, like there's more support for the NDP. Of course, the NDP is in power in British Columbia. So I think they have a strong incentive to actually move in that direction because of their base, their voters, not just Indigenous voters, but in general, they care more about reconciliation than people who on average vote for the Sask party in Saskatchewan, which has been in power since 2007. And so it really depends what party is in power and what support they have, not just within First Nations or Indigenous peoples, if you include the Métis and so forth, and the Inuit in the north. But I would say it's also what the base of the party think about these issues. So if it's a more right-leaning party, it's less likely to be sympathetic towards Indigenous grievances on average than left-leaning parties like the NDP or some provincial liberal parties. So I think it's very important to take that into account, and also what they will emphasize when they will implement this framework. In Alberta or Saskatchewan, they will implement, natural resources and how it's important for economic growth and creating jobs among Indigenous peoples, and they will be, less. I would say less interested in talking about reconciliation per se or other aspects of it, and focus more on the economic part of the equation. That's the way I see it, but I'm not an expert of Indigenous issues.
Thank you so much, Daniel. The next question goes to William Martin.
Thank you, Christina, and hello from Twickenham Backs friends. It's just a quick point of clarification from Karlo, if I may. You mentioned the pandemic and about that pushing support over 50% for Scottish independence. And did I actually hear that right? And if so, is that simply about the Scottish First Minister having been a better communicator than Johnson over the last year? And I guess it must be because Scotland's actual outcomes from the pandemic were not objectively better, a lot better than down here in England. And so maybe that means that if there has been a bit of a surge in support for independence, that maybe that might not last if that's the main factor. So that just wondering if you could say a bit more about that.
Sure. So you're right. I mean, there's a couple of points I want to make. The first one is that I'm far more willing than my quantitatively inclined colleagues to make these kinds of assertions. So again, I noted, Elza, and she was, I think I was wanting to make that kind of a point in our paper, and she was not comfortable with making that point because we did not actually have a study that dug deep into that, right? So I don't think it's only about communication, if by communication you mean style, appearance, and all that kind of stuff, because what I also have included in our paper that I referenced earlier is the timing of major decisions by the UK government versus the Scottish government. And so there's a consistent difference. It's a tiny, tiny difference, right? Usually about 2 weeks on either end, but there's this consistent difference. So the Scottish government was consistently earlier to adopt cautious measures such as mask mandate and things of that nature by 2 weeks, right? But always earlier than the UK government, with very, very few exceptions. And it was normally by 2 or 3 weeks later in implementing the loosening of the restrictions, those kinds of measures, right? So I think that's one key element of that, which helped Nicola Sturgeon appear and come off as more compassionate, more cautious, more concerned about residents of Scotland than Boris Johnson did, for some fairly, I think, obvious reasons. And then if you add on top of that, just the flip-flopping on all kinds of decisions over especially the early going during the pandemic, it is not surprising that the approval ratings of the two leaders on pandemic management could not be starker. I can't remember what the exact figures are, but they're almost inverted, right? Something to the effect of like 80% positive approval for Nicola Sturgeon and about the same negative for Boris Johnson. I mean, you need to check this, but basically something to that effect. So if you look at support for independence prior to the pandemic, it was inching up, I think, from about 2000 I would say from 2018 or thereabouts. And I think that has something to do with just the way in which it became sort of increasingly apparent that the Brexit we're going to get is going to be quite hard. But it really didn't cross that magic 50% threshold before March of last year, and that it stayed there until very recently, when we're now in dead heat, basically. So yeah.
Can I add something just about because it's interesting that if you look at what's happening in Canada today, have a parallel with the UK during the pandemic. Support for sovereignty in Quebec is low, historically low right now, especially among younger people. But we have a nationalist premier in power, François Legault, with the Coalition Avenir Québec, really a nationalist, but autonomist, not sovereignist, although he's a former sovereignist. He was a minister for the Parti Québécois. But what's interesting about Legault is that despite the fact that Quebec did very poorly during the first wave, you look at debt rates and so forth, he has found a way to maintain this popularity, in part through his public discourse, which is, and his capacity as a communicator, I would say, but also his capacity, since he has become premier, to tap into Quebec nationalism. And it's actually quite interesting to see that his popularity, despite some major issues on the ground in terms of fighting the pandemic, has remained quite strong, while other premiers, you see that with Doug Ford in Ontario right now. Jason Kenney's popularity plummeted during the second wave when Alberta faced a lot of problems. But François Legault is like a Teflon man in a way. I mean, he has found a way to, despite problems on the ground, to, among Francophones at least, he remains very, very popular. And he's almost assured to be re-elected the next time we have provincial election. And it's quite interesting how he has used this capacity to speak to people directly. There is some populist aspect to his rhetoric that is tied to nationalism that makes him, it's hard for the opposition to criticize him in an effective way, which is quite interesting. It would be also interesting to compare with the situation in Scotland and Quebec during the pandemic, how sub-state nationalism and public health can interplay from a political standpoint. That might be a paper to write at some point. Maybe you're interested, Karlo, to do something.
Thanks, Daniel. We have time for one final question, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Glenn.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for those two great talks. I have a question for Danielle, actually. I apologize, it doesn't have an immediate UK-Canada comparison to it, but representing a Quebec-based heritage group, I have to ask the Quebec-centric question. It's tax time. We're getting ready. We know we're one of I think the only jurisdiction in Canada. We have to file 2 returns. I found this really interesting, what you said about how universality and policy can contribute to our, we clearly understand universal healthcare is, I think, part of the collective memory as Canadians. It's something, even if we don't understand history, we know it's important to who we are. But then there are moments where it is frustrated as a Quebecer, which I learned, and maybe Karlo, I'm not sure, I know you were at Memorial, I was too. I was studying for 8 years as a Quebec resident in Newfoundland, and it was as if there was an attempt, a conspiracy to frustrate my ability to exercise my Canadianness through access to healthcare. Basically, anytime I had to go to the doctor, I had to pay up front. If I was lucky, I would get a reimbursement in 3 to 6 months. If I didn't tell the government, the provincial government, that I was leaving the province through a formal letter, they would try to deny my coverage. And I felt this was the first time I felt my Canadianness threatened. Of course, I have a deep affinity for Quebec as well. I feel like it created an antagonism that wasn't there before necessarily. And I guess I wondered 2 things. I'm sure there's some practical reasons. I actually don't understand the history of why we have to do a separate tax return and the healthcare transfers, but was there a symbolic reason as well in there? And the other thing I wonder is, are there some ethnographic studies, insights of the experiences of Quebecers in the rest of Canada, and how, I guess, their multi-layered identities sometimes become pitted against one another?
Yeah, that's interesting. So about taxation, I think that there is something highly symbolic in Quebec to have 2 separate claims, and this is that, you know, that Quebec is collecting the taxes and so forth. This is something that actually they are talking about in Alberta. They propose to do the same thing in Alberta to increase provincial autonomy. And a lot of the things that actually the Kenney government is discussing right now, some of the policies that they have in mind are policies that have existed in Quebec for a long time. And they want to, like, having their own provincial pension plan, like we have the Quebec pension plan, there's the Canada pension plan, now they want an Alberta pension plan, opt out of the Canada pension plan to create their own pension plan. This is things that Quebec did in the 1960s, right? When the Canada pension plan was created, we opted out of it from the beginning to create the Quebec pension plan in the name of economic nationalism. So I think taxation is really central and vital to sub-state nationalism, because you don't have a state without having your own revenues. And the symbolism of, you know, although we don't like paying taxes, but paying taxes to the provincial government and who's collecting the taxes is very important. Also, you know, what label is on the check when you receive a check, right? So Quebec much prefer to send checks to people in the province rather than having Ottawa doing it, right? So it's, I think, very, very important. Now, I don't have the ethnographic research on that specifically, but I would say that when we talk about healthcare in Quebec, you know, it's not that, although it's provincial and people are, I think the most francophones, at least in Quebec, don't really understand the link with what happened in Saskatchewan or federal politics in the mid-1960s. They associate, they see assurance maladie as something, Medicare in Quebec as something homegrown. They talk about Castonguay, Carte Soleil, you know, they have these symbols that are very Quebec-centric symbols to talk about something that emerged in the context of intergovernmental relations. But Quebec didn't start, was one of the last provinces to adopt Medicare, right? Long before, nearly a decade after Saskatchewan and so forth. But it's not a narrative that is told in Quebec. So in Quebec, Medicare is really provincial, but people have a love-hate relationship with that. I mean, there are lots of criticism of waiting times and all the problems within the healthcare system. And if you remember, you know, this movie, because people in Quebec do criticize the healthcare system all the time, and yes, they accuse Ottawa of not spending enough, spending enough money in that area to help the provinces, because Ottawa, you know, at the beginning of the system, they will finance 50% of the funding, and now they only cover less than 25% of provincial spending. But so we criticize the federal government, but there are also people in Quebec who are really critical of the management of the healthcare system. If you remember Barbarian Invasions, the movie by Denis Arcand, and he was criticized for that, but there's a scene in Barbarian Invasions where this person who has cancer is dying, and he has to go to the US to undertake special treatment that's not available in Quebec. And the way the Quebec healthcare system is described by Arcan in his movie, it's, you know, dominated by really corrupt unions, and it's very, very negative. And then he arrives to the US border, and then the guy is in the stretch in the back of the ambulance. The doors open, he sees the American flag, and it's like, I'm saved, you know, which goes against the narrative that you have in Canada, that the fact that we have universal coverage in Canada, it's better than the US. But that movie was really counterintuitive, but it expressed some of the frustrations that ordinary Quebecers have towards the healthcare system, which they find is overly bureaucratic, too slow, not responsive, and so forth. So, you know, it's a love-hate relationship that people have with it. And maybe it's the same thing in the UK with the NHS. When people have to wait for a long time for treatment, you know, this is something that happens on the ground.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel. That was really fascinating. I think it's time to wrap things up for today. This has been such a pleasure hosting this event. I'm going to, before I give my final thanks, I'm going to hand things over to Tony, who's going to give some concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Well, that was a great panel to end what I think has been a really good conference. I got a long list of thanks here. I'll do it in a kind of chronological way from the origins of the conference. Don't worry, it won't take too long. But it wasn't that long ago that we weren't sure whether we'd be able to manage a conference this year for the pandemic and other reasons. But we decided that the BACS Council and the BACS Conference Committee, which was essentially Jimmy, Ellie and myself, that it was essential to do so, even if it was a mini conference, as we've called it. And so, first of all, thanks to the conference committee and the chairs for getting the programme together. Obviously, thanks to all of the speakers, all been brilliant. And I must mention especially the Eccles lecturer, Rob Dunbar, yesterday. I think for a mini conference, we've actually covered a great deal of ground. And I've been particularly pleased at the very strong Canada-UK relationship and dimension that's come through from it, the British perspective, which you don't always get in BACS conferences in Britain, frankly. Sometimes, especially when you've got literally scores of papers, a lot of them are just about Canada, which is fine. But I think in an organisation called BACS, it's not a bad idea to have these kind of comparisons and a British perspective, and we've certainly done that this time. So we've had a panel, first one that's looked particularly at racial issues, partly from a British perspective. The second one, very importantly, Indigenous issues. Thirdly, today, the issue obviously of Quebec sovereignty, but especially from a British perspective. And last but not least, this very good comparative dimension, and especially Canada, the UK, and to some extent the US, and also a very interdisciplinary conference. So very, very pleased. Thanks I must give to our sponsors and our stakeholders, especially in Britain, Canada High Commission, the Quebec Delegation in London, they're great supporters, Canada UK Foundation, various university centres, not least Jimmy's, Edinburgh, and my own at UCL. But last but certainly not least, very many thanks to Kwan for doing such a superb job with the organisation and the technical side of the conference. Thanks to your president, Grant Myers, for his very welcoming remarks at the beginning. And especially thanks, Christina, to you and to Glenn for, as I say, doing a marvellous job. I think everyone has seen this over the last 2 days, but there's a lot of behind the scenes emailing, going backwards and forwards, and almost minute by minute logistical schedules being drawn up. So it really has been an excellent organisation. And I can reassure you and everyone that BACS will certainly want to continue its collaboration with Kwan over the coming years. I think we've reached quite a large Canadian audience over these last 2 days, and I think as the relationship grows, that Canada-UK link, which is a particular interest of mine, will grow and prosper. So thank you very much to you and to everyone who's attended.
Thank you so much, Tony. I feel like it has been a very successful collaboration as well, and I'm sure that my colleagues at Quan will agree. We certainly can, be inspired by some of the material, if not all of the material that we discussed here over the last 2 days, for perhaps future collaborations and continuing these discussions. So on behalf of Quan, I do want to thank everyone today and yesterday for joining us. I want to thank everyone on the BACS team, of course, Tony, James, and Eleanor for helping make this such a successful event. And I think I've run out of things to say, so I'll thank everyone again and have a lovely weekend.
Okay, thanks, Christina. Yeah, bye to everyone.
Bye, thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Karlo.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.